A second ago, he'd been blinded by headlights on a night highway in Iowa. Now he was kneeling in a stone hall inside someone else's body, and a window hung before his eyes like in a video game. Class. Farmer. And the whole hall erupted in laughter. Daniel Hayes opens his eyes and doesn't understand a thing. Rows of teenagers in identical white shirts stand all around him, all 16 years old, all staring straight ahead with the same look of terror and hope. He clenches his fists, his fingers obey, his heart is beating. He's alive. Or dead, or something else entirely. Ahead, on a stone platform, an old man in a golden robe places his hand on the forehead of the next teenager. The altar flashes blue. The priest's voice echoes under the arches like a bell. Sword-bearer of light. The hall roars with delight. Fire mage. Parents jump up from their benches. Holy paladin. Every name sounds like a prize. Daniel stands in line and counts heads, and he sees what the others do not. A translucent window hangs before his eyes. Name: Daniel Hayes. Class: undetermined. He runs his hand through it. His hand passes right through. The line creeps forward. 10 people. 5. 3. 1. It's his turn. He climbs the steps. The priest looks at him and suddenly frowns. Something flashes in the old man's eyes. Surprise. Or fear. A hand rests on his forehead, hot and dry. The altar flares up, but not blue, green. The hall freezes. The priest mutters more quietly than usual. Class. Farmer. 2 seconds of silence. Then a chuckle. Then laughter rolls through the rows like a wave. Mother covers her face with her hands. Father stands up and walks out without looking back. And Daniel stands on the platform and looks out at the laughing hall. The window before his eyes refreshes. Understanding the soil. Basic agriculture. Seed collection. He reads every line twice, and he thinks very calmly. These people live in a world where food doesn't fall from the sky, where every grain is planted by someone, and they're laughing at the one who knows how to do it. There's one thing they don't know. Daniel spent 3 years developing drought-tolerant wheat in a lab at the University of Iowa. He knows crop rotation. He knows nitrogen fixation. He knows soil chemistry and fungal symbiosis. And here, right before his eyes, hangs a system that amplifies all of that. He bows to the priest briefly and calmly. He walks down. Someone shouts after him, "Good luck with the carrots." He doesn't look back. At the distribution office, the official doesn't even look up. Loughtonfield County, Loughtonfield Village, 17 residents. Here are 5 silver coins. Here's a sack of grain. Go. Daniel unties the sack and peeks inside. The wheat is small, dull, unbleached, and a quarter mixed with weeds. At the university, he would have received a reprimand for grain like this. Here, it's standard issue for a rookie. He slings the sack over his shoulder and heads out onto the southern road. 3 days on the road teach him more than any textbook. He looks at the fields and sees a death sentence. Nothing but wheat everywhere. Not a single bean field. Not a speck of clover among the crops. The earth is gray and trampled. These people have been plundering their soil for generations and pray to the goddess Era that at least something will grow. But the sky is dry. The clouds are high. The rivers are running at a third of their usual flow. In the capital, they call this a normal cycle. Daniel looks at the water, at the sky, at the dead earth, and understands. This isn't a cycle. This is the beginning of a famine, and no one here is ready. At a roadside inn, 2 guys who've just been initiated are eyeing his sack. The swordsman nudges his friend loudly enough. I saw it. A farmer. In a year, he'll be shoveling manure and crying. Daniel finishes his water, stands up, and walks out in silence. He has nothing to prove to 2 boys. Any swordsman can kill 100 people, but not a single one can feed even a dozen, and winter always comes. On the 3rd day, he turns into the hills. He stops every half hour. He squats down. He rubs the earth between his fingers. He sniffs, tastes it on his tongue. Clay, sour, dense. But he digs deeper with a stick and finds a dark layer beneath the topsoil. Humus. Old but alive. This land was once loved, then abandoned. It has grown over, but has not died. He straightens up and looks around with new eyes. Sloping south, a stream in the lowlands. Build terraces along the slope. Dig drainage ditches. Create a pond at the bottom. Deacidify the soil with ash and lime. Plant legumes in the first season for nitrogen. This isn't exile. It's a gift. Lowenfield opens up beyond the last hill. 17 houses. Crooked fences, overgrown vegetable patches. A frail old woman with a face as weathered as oak bark comes out of the nearest house. She looks at him and at the sack of paper, and she starts coughing, a long, wrenching cough. She pulls the rag from her lips, and there's blood on the rag. "Mira, the village elder," she wheezes. "You're our new farmer." Daniel nods. He looks at the blood on the rag. He looks at the thicket by the fence, and among the weeds, he spots what he was looking for. A bush with gray-green leaves and yellow flowers. Local coltsfoot. Nearby, broad dark leaves resembling plantain. Weeds, trash by local standards. Daniel shifts his gaze from the bloodstain to the weeds, and says he needs honey, and a pot, and an hour. He found the honey at beekeeper Thorne's. The old man lived on the edge of the village and kept 12 hives. He had so much honey, he didn't know what to do with it. No one came to Lowenfield to shop. The road here was too long, and the goods too cheap for merchants to bother with. Thorne looked at the new farmer with his sack of grain and asked why he wanted honey. Daniel said he wanted to make something for the village elder. Thorne shrugged. He took out a clay pot, scooped up some honey, held it out, and said it would cost a penny. Daniel handed over his last small coin from his wages. He returned to Mira's house. She had set him up in an outbuilding next to the barn. 4 walls, a roof with a hole, a cot, a stool, a window without glass. Daniel set the sack of grain in the corner and went out into the backyard. He picked some leaves from a gray-green bush. He picked broad, dark leaves resembling plantain. He rubbed them between his hands. He sniffed them. The texture and smell were almost identical to their earthly counterparts. He couldn't be 100% sure, but he had no other options. Mira was coughing up blood. The potion for lung disease cost 50 gold pieces. The entire village didn't have even 5. Daniel lit a fire in the hearth. He boiled water in a pot. He threw in the coltsfoot leaves. He waited for the decoction to darken. He strained it through a cloth. He added honey. He added crushed plantain leaves. He stirred it. He let it cool. The result was a thick, dark syrup with a herbal scent. He brought the pot to his face and sniffed. Nothing poisonous. Nothing suspicious. At worst, it's just sweet herbal tea. At best, it was an anti-inflammatory and soothing remedy for the lungs. He took the syrup to Mira. He told her to take 3 sips in the morning and 3 in the evening. Mira looked at him long and hard. She asked how a young guy knew about herbs. Daniel said his grandmother had taught him. It was a lie, but there was more truth to it than he could explain. Mira took the first sip. She grimaced. She took the second. The third. She nodded and said it was bitter, but tolerable. Daniel left her house and finally took a proper look around the village. 17 residents, 4 families. Beekeeper Thorne, a couple of old folks, a widow with 2 children, 2 women who ran a household together, and Mira. The vegetable gardens were in terrible shape. Daniel walked from house to house and looked around. Cabbage was growing right next to last year's cabbage in the same spot. Turnips were planted in the shade of the fence where they didn't get enough sun. The garden beds had neither drainage nor mulch. Weeds stood like a wall. Goat manure lay in a heap behind the sheds, and no one thought to work it into the soil. The water from the well was murky and hard. Daniel crouched by the well. He scooped up a handful. He tasted it. Chalky. Hard. It was tolerable for watering, but you'd need a filter to drink it. He summoned the status window. It obediently appeared before his eyes. He began to sort through his skills. The first-level soil understanding skill provided basic information. He sat down by the nearest garden bed and activated the skill. Numbers appeared before his eyes. Acidity, high. Moisture, low. Density, high. Vitality, 3 out of 100. 3 out of 100. The soil was nearly dead. He checked the next bed. Vitality 2. The next one, 4. The best plot in the village showed a vitality of 7. Daniel stood up and dusted off his knees. The situation was worse than he'd thought, but not hopeless. He remembered the dark, humus-rich horizon on the hills along the road here. The land beneath the village had once been fertile. It had simply been killed by improper treatment. First, he walked around all the vegetable gardens and gathered weeds. Not all of them, only certain ones. He was looking for legumes, and he found them. In the backyards near Beekeeper Thorne, a wild bush with small pods was growing. Peas, or something like peas. A weed by local standards. Daniel gathered all the pods he could find. He shelled them until dark by the light of an oil lamp. He ended up with 2 handfuls of seeds. Small, round, hard. In his status window, they were listed as wild vines peas. Use: none. Value: none. The system considered them trash. Daniel knew better. Legumes fix atmospheric nitrogen through bacteria in the nodules on their roots. That was the key to everything. The next morning, he got to work. He marked out a plot behind the barn, 20 steps by 10, his first field. The status window displayed the basic agriculture skill and suggested a planting template. Straight rows, single crop, standard spacing. Daniel rejected the template. He divided the plot into 4 sectors. First sector: vine peas, to restore nitrogen in the soil. Second sector: wheat from a standard bag. But first, he sorted the grain by hand, removed weed seeds, removed small and damaged grains, left only the large and whole ones. 2 kilograms remained out of 3. Third sector: left fallow, just dug it over and mulched it with weeds. Let the soil rest. Fourth sector: mixed planting, wheat and vetch together, an experiment. He wanted to see how the system would react to intercropping. Digging up the plot took 2 days. He had no horse and no plow, just a shovel he borrowed from Thorn. Daniel dug from dawn until dusk. His hands were covered in calluses by the end of the first day. His back was on fire. His legs were throbbing. His body was young and unaccustomed to such work, though in his past life he had spent his days in the fields. On the evening of the first day, Mira brought him a bowl of porridge and a mug of milk. He thanked her. Mira stood there and said that over the past 30 years, 4 farmers had been sent to them. The first one started drinking after a month. The second ran away. The third hanged himself. The fourth simply stopped leaving the house and one night just walked away. Daniel ate his porridge in silence. Mira said she didn't want to bury him. Daniel replied that he wasn't going to die, that he had a plan. Mira snorted. She said that everyone had a plan, and she walked away, coughing into a rag. But the coughing had already quieted down. There was no blood. On the second day of digging, Daniel mixed everything he'd found into the soil: goat manure from the piles behind the barns, ash from the stoves, rotten leaves from the ditch behind the village, crushed eggshells from Widow Larson's chickens. He explained to everyone he took materials from what he was doing and why. Widow Larson looked at him as if he were crazy when he asked for the shells. She asked why a farmer would want trash. Daniel said that the shells contain calcium. That calcium reduces soil acidity. That acidic soil prevents roots from absorbing nutrients. The widow blinked. She looked at her garden beds. She looked at him and brought out a bucket of eggshells. He mixed it all in with the soil. He dug it over again. He watered it with water from the well, and he planted the runner beans in the first section, the selected wheat in the second. He left the third empty. In the fourth, he planted both crops, alternating the rows. Then he mulched everything with dry grass so the moisture wouldn't evaporate. The status window flashed. The basic farming skill had risen to level 2. New ability: accelerated growth, level 1. The description read, crops planted by the skill's owner grow 10% faster. 10%, not much. But in a world where crops are harvested once a season, 10% is an extra week. An extra week is extra stock before winter. Daniel read the description again, and for the first time in 3 days in this world, felt that the system wasn't the enemy. It was a tool. A blunt, crude, primitive tool in the hands of people who didn't understand how to use it, but a tool nonetheless. A week passed. Daniel worked every day from dawn to dusk. He watered, he weeded, he observed. He wrote everything down in a notebook made of sewn-together pieces of cloth, because there was no paper in the village. The vetch sprouted first. On the third day, pale green sprouts emerged from the ground. By the end of the week, they were as tall as a palm. The system showed the growth of root nodules, and for the first time, Daniel saw how the magical interface displayed what he knew from textbooks. Nitrogen fixation. Bacteria in the nodules. The nitrogen level in the soil of the first sector began to rise. From 3 vitality units to 5 in 7 days. A trifle for the system. A revolution for this land. The wheat in the second sector sprouted on the 5th day, normal. The third sector was resting. And the fourth. The fourth sector showed something interesting. The wheat planted next to the vetch peas was growing faster than the wheat in the clean sector. 15% faster. 10 from skill and another 5. Where did the 5 come from? Daniel crouched over the bed and activated soil understanding. The vitality of the fourth sector was higher than in the second. The vetch had already begun releasing nitrogen into the soil, and the wheat next to it was receiving more nutrients. Intercropping provided a bonus. The system saw it. The system calculated it. But the system didn't suggest it in the templates, because no one had ever tried it. In the 1,000 years of the farmer class's existence, not a single farmer in Illyrian had thought to plant two crops side by side so they could help each other. Daniel crouched in the middle of his small field and looked at the sprouts, and he thought, if companion planting provides a bonus, what would a full crop rotation provide? What would compost provide? What would mulching provide? What would proper drainage and terracing provide? What would all of this together provide? He didn't know the exact figures, but he knew the direction, and the direction was upward. By the end of the second week, Mira had stopped coughing, completely. She came to him in the morning and stood silently. Daniel straightened up over the garden bed, shovel in hand. Mira said she was feeling better, that she hadn't coughed up blood for 6 days, that the dandelion syrup had helped more than the prayers she'd been saying for 3 years. She wasn't say thank him. She just stood there and looked at him with different eyes. Then she asked what else he could do. Daniel stuck the shovel in the ground and said he could do a lot of things. But first, he needed help. He needed lime. Or ash. Lots of ash. And he needed the villagers to stop dumping their slop into the ditch and instead pour it into the compost pit he would dig. And he needed no one to urinate in the well. Mira looked at him for a very long time. Then she said she couldn't promise anything about the well, but she would gather some ash. It was the first time Daniel saw something resembling a smile on her face. That evening, a boy of about 10 came to see him, the son of the widow Larson. He said his mother had sent him to ask, "Their goat has mastitis. Does Mr. Farmer have any remedy?" Daniel asked what herbs grew around the village. The boy didn't know. Daniel took him by the hand and walked with him to the meadow behind the village. They wandered for an hour. Daniel pointed out plants and explained, "This is an antiseptic. This is a painkiller. This is just a weed. This is poisonous, don't touch it." The boy listened with his mouth agape. Daniel found a bush with small white flowers that appeared in the status window as field silverweed. Properties: weak antiseptic. Application: undetermined. He picked a handful of flowers, crushed them, mixed them with goat fat. It turned into a coarse ointment. He gave it to the boy and told him to rub it on the goat's udder morning and evening. 3 days later, Widow Larson came to him herself. The goat was milking as before. The widow brought a pot of milk and a basket of eggs. She thanked him and said she'd been wrong to think a farmer was a nobody. Daniel took the milk and eggs and said a farmer isn't a nobody. A farmer is someone who feeds those who then feed everyone else. The widow didn't understand, but she nodded and left. And in the evening, Daniel sat on the porch of his outbuilding and opened the status window. Level 2. Soil Understanding Skill, Level 2. Basic Farming, Level 2. Accelerated Growth, Level 1. Seed Gathering, Level 1. And a new line. Reputation in Loughtonfield, Neutral, up from Indifferent. He looked at that line and thought, 3 weeks, 2 patients cured, 1 field planted. Reputation, Neutral. Not hostile, not warm, neutral. It was progress, slow, quiet, invisible to the world, but progress. Somewhere in the capital of Valdemir, King Tiberius was preparing for a tournament. The northern clans were sharpening their swords, the southern merchants were counting their profits, and in a remote village of 17 people, a guy with the farmer class sat on the porch and looked at his garden beds in the moonlight. And he knew that in a year, this place would be unrecognizable. He went to bed. Tomorrow he had to dig a compost pit. The first month in Loughtonfield was spent in dirt and sweat. Daniel dug the compost pit for 3 days. A deep one, 2 meters long, 1 meter wide, and 1.5 meters deep. He lined the walls with a wicker fence made of willow twigs so they wouldn't crumble. He explained to the villagers that this was where food scraps went. Vegetable tops, goat manure, rotten leaves, everything except meat and bones. Thor the beekeeper asked why he was burying the trash. Daniel said that in 2 months, this trash would turn into the most valuable thing on the farm. Thor tapped his temple with a finger, but he started bringing the trash anyway. The system reacted to every action. When Daniel buried the first batch of compost, the status window flashed. New skill, Organic Processing, Level 1. Description: Organic material buried by the skill's owner decomposes 20% faster. 2 months, instead of the standard 2.5. Another small thing, another advantage. He understood the system's logic. It didn't grant power, it granted acceleration. Every skill saved time, and in agriculture, time was everything. The wheat in the experimental field had grown knee-high in 3 weeks, an impossible speed by local standards. Mrs. Larson came to look every morning. She stood by the fence and shook her head silently. Her own wheat in the garden was growing half as fast. Daniel offered to help her with the garden beds. She agreed. He came over and, first thing, dug everything up. He removed the cabbage from the spot where it had been growing for 3 years straight. He planted peas there. He moved the cabbage to a new spot. He added ash and manure. He mulched it. The widow stood nearby, watching wide-eyed. She asked why he was moving the cabbage. Daniel explained it simply. The soil gets tired. Every plant takes something different from the soil. If you plant the same thing in the same spot, the soil gives everything it can and dies. You have to rotate crops. You have to let it rest. You have to feed it just as it feeds people. The widow listened and didn't interrupt. Then she said that her late husband had planted cabbage in that spot for 30 years. Daniel said that her husband had been a good man, but the soil had grown tired over 30 years. The widow nodded. She paused and said that the soil, yes, it gets tired. Daniel realized she wasn't just talking about the soil. He helped 2 more families. He redesigned each garden from scratch. Each time, he explained what he was doing and why. People listened. Not everyone believed him, but they listened. The status window showed how the soil's vitality was slowly creeping upward on each plot, from 2 or 3 units to 5 or 6. The compost pit was working. The ash reduced the acidity. The mulch retained moisture. The peas supplied nitrogen. Everything was just like in a textbook, only the textbook was in his head, and the world around him was magical. And on the 32nd day, the magic finally revealed itself. Daniel was checking his experimental plot in the morning and saw something new in the 4th sector, among the wheat and peas. A small sprout with silvery leaves. He definitely hadn't planted it. The plant had appeared on its own. He crouched down and activated soil understanding. The status window displayed information that made him freeze. Moon chamomile. A magical crop. Rank E. Properties. Accelerates the healing of minor wounds and scratches. Conditions for growth. Soil vitality above 10. Joint planting of 2 or more crops. Basic agriculture skill level no lower than 2nd. The magical plant had grown on its own, out of nothing, because he had created the right conditions. Daniel crouched down and stared at the silvery sprout, his hands trembling. Not from fear, from understanding. The system didn't just accelerate growth. The system generated new crops when the conditions aligned. Local farmers had never raised the soil's vitality above 10 because they didn't know how. They never planted different crops together because the template said to plant just one. They never saw magical plants in their garden beds. And they decided that a farmer couldn't work with magic. That magic was the privilege of the warrior classes. They were wrong. Magic had been in the earth all along. It was just that no one knew how to awaken it. Daniel carefully fenced off the sprout with sticks. He watered it. He mulched around it. And he ran to Mira. The village elder came out onto the porch. She wasn't coughing at all anymore. Her cheeks had turned pink. Her back was slightly straighter. The syrup was working. Daniel told her that a magical plant had grown in his field. Mira dropped the rag she was holding. She asked again, magical, in the field, of farmers. She went to look. She stood over the silvery sprout for a minute, 2, 3. Then she turned to Daniel and said quietly, she's lived here for 40 years. 4 farmers have come and gone. Not a single one has grown anything magical. Not a single one. Daniel said it wasn't about him. It was about the soil. He simply gave the soil what it asked for. Mira looked at him with the kind of gaze people use when they begin to realize they're facing someone on a different level. She said nothing more. She went back to her place. But that evening, Daniel noticed her talking with Thorn and the Larson widow. All 3 of them were looking toward his field. The moon daisy was growing fast. Within a week, it had grown to knee height. The silvery leaves opened up in his palm. White flowers with lilac centers appeared on the 10th day. The system showed progress. Maturity, 30%, 50, 70. On the 15th day, the flower was fully mature. The system suggested harvesting. Daniel plucked the flower. It was light and warm. The translucent petals shimmered in his hands with a barely perceptible silver light. The status window displayed the information. Moon daisy, harvested, fresh. Shelf life, 7 days. Effect with external application. Accelerates the healing of minor wounds and scratches by 50%. Market value, 3 silver per flower. 3 silver coins. for a single flower. His total earnings were 5 silver coins for everything. A flower that had grown on its own from the ground was worth more than half of everything the crown had given him. Daniel turned the daisy over in his hands, he thought, and took it to the widow Larson's son. The boy had cut his hand with an axe 2 days ago. The wound wasn't deep, but it was festering. Daniel crushed the petals into a paste and applied it to the wound. By morning, the wound had healed. Clean, without a trace. The boy ran to him at dawn and showed his hand to everyone he could find. "Look, it's healed. Mr. Farmer grew a magic flower. It's healed." Widow Larson came with a pie. She silently set it on the table. She silently left. His reputation in Loughtonfield rose to friendly. Daniel planted another plot, a bigger one, 30 by 20 feet. This time he knew what to do. Mixed planting. Legumes next to grains, compost, ash, mulch. The soil's vitality in the new plot after preparation was 12, above the threshold for magical crops. He waited. On the 8th day after planting, another silvery sprout appeared, then a second, then a third. By the end of the second month, he had 7 moon daisies growing at the same time, 7 flowers, 21 silver coins, more than the village saw in a year. But Daniel wasn't in a hurry to sell. He understood something important. Money wasn't the main thing. What mattered most was that the system unlocked new crops as his skills and conditions improved. The moon daisy was rank E, the lowest. What would be at rank D? At rank C? At rank B? What would grow if he raised the soil's vitality to 50, to 100? He didn't know, but he was going to find out. Meanwhile, life in the village was changing, slowly but surely. The vegetable gardens he had redesigned were yielding more. For the first time in 5 years, Widow Larson had harvested enough cabbage to pickle a barrel for the winter. Thorne noticed that the bees were flying to Daniel's field more often than anywhere else, and the honey had become thicker. The children ran to his field as if it were an amusement park. They watched the silvery flowers grow. They asked why and how and what for. Daniel answered every question, patiently, in detail, like a teacher. He explained that the earth was alive, that there are tiny creatures in it that you can't see with the naked eye, that these creatures eat what he puts in the compost, that they turn trash into food for plants. The children listened with their mouths agape. One boy asked if it was true that being a farmer was a disgraceful profession. Daniel crouched down in front of him and said that there is no profession more honorable than the one you aren't proud of, and there is no profession more honorable than the one in which you have become a master. The boy nodded seriously. He probably didn't understand, but he remembered. On the evening of the 3rd month, Daniel sat on the porch and updated his notes on the ragged pages. Level 3. Soil. Understanding. Level 3. Basic agriculture. Level 3. Accelerated growth. Level 2. Seed collection. Level 2. Organic processing. Level 1. New skill. Magical agriculture. Level 1. Description. Allows for the targeted cultivation of E-rank magical crops. Increases the chance of spontaneous magical sprouts appearing by 30%. Magical agriculture, a skill that, according to his data, no farmer in the kingdom possessed. Because no farmer had ever raised the soil's vitality to the required threshold. Because no one had tried. Daniel closed the status window. He looked up at the sky. The stars here were different, large and close. 2 months ago, he had stood in a hall full of laughing people. A farmer, a disgrace, a failure. Now he was sitting on the porch of a crooked house in a village at the edge of the world. He had a small field and 7 magical flowers, and a village that was beginning to believe in him. And a plan. A big, quiet, patient plan. He went to bed. Tomorrow, he had to prepare the plot for the new crop. The end of the 3rd month brought an uninvited guest to the farm. Daniel was digging a new garden bed when he heard a scream from the road. Then a second scream. Then the sound of something heavy falling into the grass. He stuck his shovel in the ground and walked toward the road. A woman was lying on the shoulder, young, in leather armor torn on her left side. Her light hair was matted with blood. A fresh scar ran across her eyebrow. She clutched a sword in her right hand. Her left arm hung limply. Thorne stood nearby with a pitchfork. He shifted his gaze from the woman to Daniel and back. He said he'd found her by the stream, that she'd been walking and had fallen, that she wore knight's armor but had no insignia of an order, and that she needed to be handed over to the guards in the nearest town because a knight without insignia is a deserter or a criminal. Daniel crouched down next to the woman. She was unconscious. Her breathing was ragged and shallow. The wound on her side was deep, not fatal, but infected. 2 or 3 days without treatment, a fever, the onset of infection. If she wasn't helped, she would die within a day. Daniel looked at Thorne and said he wouldn't call the guards. Thorne gripped the pitchfork tighter. He asked why. Daniel said because she was dying, and the guards don't take the dead. Thorne stood there. He cursed. He helped carry the woman into the barn. Daniel worked quickly. He washed the wound with boiled water. He ground the moon chamomile into a paste and applied it to the wound. It was his best flour, and he used it without a second thought. The chamomile healed the scratches overnight. A deep wound was beyond its power, but it could reduce the inflammation. He added an ointment made from field silverweed. He bandaged her with rags he had boiled beforehand. He cooked a broth of goat meat with herbs. He spoon-fed it to her when she came to for a few minutes, and then slipped back into unconsciousness. 3 days, 3 nights. Daniel barely slept. He changed the bandages. He fed her the broth. He wiped her forehead with a wet cloth. On the 4th morning, the woman opened her eyes, gray, sharp, the eyes of a person accustomed to waking up with a sword in hand. She looked at the barn ceiling, at the straw beneath her, at Daniel, who was sitting nearby with a mug in his hand. And the first thing she did was try to stand up and grab for her weapon. Her left hand wouldn't obey. She hissed in pain and sank back down. Daniel calmly said that the sword was under the bed, that she was safe, that the village was called Loughtonfield, and that no one knew who she was, and no one cared. The woman looked at him for a minute. Then she asked who he was. Daniel said he was a farmer. She looked at his calloused hands and at the mug of broth, and said that farmers didn't heal people. Daniel said this one did. He held out the mug. She took it with her right hand. She drank for a long time, thirstily. Then she leaned back on the straw and said her name was Ariel. Ariel Wenright, a former knight of the Order of the Silver Thorn. Former because the order had expelled her. Daniel didn't ask why. It was none of his business. He said the wound was healing, but her left arm wouldn't recover anytime soon, that she needed to eat and rest, and that he'd make some more broth. Ariel watched his back as he walked out of the barn. She lay there for a week. Daniel fed her 3 times a day. Broth, porridge with milk, boiled vegetables, bread that Mrs. Larson had baked at his request. Ariel ate in silence, a lot, greedily, like someone who hadn't eaten their fill in a long time. Daniel noticed a lot about her. The scar across her eyebrow was old. On her hands were marks from handcuffs worn for years, calluses on her palms from a sword hilt. Her muscles, even emaciated, were hard and dry. She was a professional fighter, and she ate his simple porridge with an expression he couldn't understand. He only understood on the 5th day, when he brought her dinner and she stopped with the spoon halfway to her mouth. She looked at the plate, she looked at him, and she said quietly, she had been eating from the barracks communal pot for 10 years, the same slop. No one had ever fed her separately, personally. This bowl of porridge. It was the first meal in 10 years that someone had prepared personally for her. Daniel didn't know how to respond. He said he'd add honey to the porridge tomorrow because she needed calories to heal. Ariel lowered her eyes and continued eating. By the end of the 2nd week, she was up. Her left arm didn't work well, but her right one did. She went out into the yard and saw the farm, the field, wheat sprouts, the silvery flowers of moon daisies, the compost pit, the garden beds, the goats, the children running between the rows. She stood and watched. Then she walked around the farm, silently, carefully, like a scout surveying a position. She returned to Daniel and said that the fence on the north side was rotten, that the road from the highway was visible from the hill, that there wasn't a single defensive structure in the village, and that if anyone wanted to take his harvest, he'd have nothing to protect it with. Daniel said he knew. Ariel was silent for a moment. Then she said she would stay. Not for long, just until her hand healed. And while she was here, she could fix the fence. Daniel nodded. He said he'd be glad to have her, and that for dinner there would be stewed meat and vegetables. Ariel fixed the fence in 3 days. Then she reinforced the gate. Then she cut down some stakes and put up a simple fence around the perimeter. Then she started training every morning in the backyard. Sword in her right hand, strikes against a wooden post, over and over, hour after hour. The children ran over to watch. Thorne shook his head and said that now the village had its own crazy farmer and its own crazy knight. A full set. Daniel got used to her quickly. Ariel was quiet. She didn't pry with questions. She didn't get in the way of work. She ate for 3 and didn't apologize for it. She spoke little and to the point. He noticed she liked spicy food. He added some pepper he'd found among the wild herbs to her plate. Ariel tasted it. She raised her eyebrows. She asked what it was. Daniel said it was wild pepper. Ariel said it was the best thing she'd ever eaten in her life. Daniel said it was just pepper. Ariel didn't reply. But that evening, for the first time, she sat down to dinner not in the barn, but at the communal table. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, in silence. Ariel sharpened her sword. Daniel wrote down his observations. Sometimes they exchanged a few words. How's your hand? Better. How's the wheat? Growing. Quiet. Peaceful. For the first time in months in this world, Daniel didn't feel alone. Meanwhile, the farm was thriving. The magical agriculture skill had risen to level 2. The system unlocked a new function, targeted planting of rank E magical crops. Previously, moon chamomile had appeared spontaneously. Now he could plant it intentionally. The system displayed the recipe. Soil with vitality above 15. Chamomile seeds harvested from a mature flower. Water with ash added. Daniel collected seeds from the first flowers. He planted a new bed. A whole row of moon chamomiles. 12 bushes. 2 weeks later, all 12 bloomed. He harvested and counted. 12 flowers. 36 silver coins. More than the village earned in 6 months. But there was no one to sell them to. It was a 2-day journey to the nearest town, Westmere. Daniel couldn't leave the farm for 4 days. Thorne said that once a month, a traveling merchant named Fellis passed through the village. He bought honey and hides. Maybe he'd take the flowers too. Daniel waited for Fellis, a short, nimble man with a cart and shrewd eyes. Fellis looked at the moon daisies and froze. Where did they come from? Daniel said he'd grown them. Felix touched the petals. He sniffed them. He bit into one. His eyes widened. He said that in town, people pay 3 silver coins for flowers like these. He was willing to pay 1.5. Daniel looked at him calmly and said 2.5. Fellis said 2. Daniel said 2.25, and that was his final offer. Fellis grunted. He scratched his nose. He agreed. Daniel sold 10 flowers, 22 silver coins and 5 copper coins. He kept 2 flowers, one for Mira in case she cut herself, the second for Ariel. The knight took the flower and looked at it for a long time. Then she said that in the order, they would pay 5 silver coins for one like that, and that the merchant had cheated him. Daniel said he knew, but right now he needed a sales channel, not the highest price. Ariel raised an eyebrow. She looked at him differently, as if he were a man who thinks more than one move ahead. Daniel spent the money that same day. He gave Mira 10 silver coins for the village's needs. He bought iron tools from Fellis, 2 sickles, a new hoe, a copper watering can, turnip and onion seeds that Fellis had brought from the city, and one thing he asked to be brought next time. Glass, or something like glass. Fellis asked why a farmer would need glass. Daniel said he wanted to build a greenhouse. Fellis didn't know what a greenhouse was. Daniel explained an enclosed structure with a glass roof. Sunlight comes inside. The heat doesn't escape. Plants inside grow even in winter. Fellis opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Said he'd bring the glass in a month, and that it would be expensive. Daniel said he would pay with flowers. Fellis left. Daniel stood on the road and watched him go. A trade route was established. Weak, unreliable. One trader once a month. But it was a start. That evening, he sat with Ariel by the fire and told her his plan. Not the whole thing, but enough. He said he was going to make this village self-sufficient, that in 6 months, Loutenfield wouldn't need anything, that in a year, people would come here for his produce. Ariel listened in silence. Then she said the plan was good, and that he would be killed long before he could carry it out. Daniel asked why. Ariel said he didn't understand how this world worked. Magical plants were a resource. A resource attracts attention. Attention attracts greed. Greed attracts swords. She said that a greedy merchant would tell the city about the flowers. The city would tell the guild. The guild would send people, and those people wouldn't bargain. Daniel listened and realized she was right. He'd thought about it before. One arsonist with a torch, and a year's work would turn to ashes. He looked at Ariel and said that was exactly why he needed someone with a sword. Ariel looked at him, at his field in the moonlight, at the silvery flowers shimmering in the darkness, at the village behind them, at the children who were already asleep, at the warm fire. And she said she would stay. Not for long. Just stay. Daniel nodded. He tossed some wood onto the fire. They sat in silence for another hour. Somewhere in the darkness, a cricket chirped. The fourth month began with rain, the first in 3 weeks. Daniel stood under the open sky and let the raindrops fall on his face. Everyone in the village was happy. He wasn't. The rain was light, brief, 40 minutes, and that was it. The ground absorbed the moisture to a depth of 5 centimeters and dried out by evening. He checked the stream in the lowland. The water level had dropped another hand's width over the past month. In a past life, he would have said this was the beginning of a long-term drought. Here, he didn't know the climate cycles, but his instinct told him the same thing. The water was disappearing, slowly, imperceptibly to those who weren't looking, but inexorably. He began building a water collection system that very day. Ariel helped carry stones, Daniel the channel. From the stream, he dug a ditch 30 paces to the lower edge of the field. The ditch was shallow, 2 palms wide, sloping toward the storage pond he had been digging for 3 days. The pond was the size of a room, 1.5 meters deep. He lined the bottom with clay he had gathered on the hillside. He packed it down. He filled it with water. The clay set and held. The water didn't seep into the ground, the simplest of reservoirs. The villagers watched with interest. Thorn asked, "Why dig a hole for water if there's a well?" Daniel said the well is fed by groundwater. Groundwater depends on rain. There isn't much rain, so the well could run dry. But the pond collects water from the surface. Every rain, every stream, every morning dew. It's a safety net. Thorn scratched his beard. He said that in 40 years, the well had never run dry. Daniel said that in 40 years, there hadn't been 3 dry seasons in a row. Thorn fell silent. He thought for a moment. Then he went to help dig. From the pond, Daniel dug a second ditch leading to the field. But not just any ditch. He made it with branches. Each branch ran along a row of plants. In each branch, he drilled small holes at regular intervals. Water from the pond flowed by gravity through the main ditch. It entered the branches. Through the holes, it dripped to the roots of the plants. Slowly, evenly, with no loss to evaporation. Drip irrigation. The simplest version of all possible ones. Clay channels instead of hoses, stones instead of faucets. But the principle is the same. Water goes where it's needed and in the amount needed. Ariel stood over his construction and watched with an expression he had learned to recognize. It was respect. The silent, practical respect of a warrior who sees competent fortification. Only this was no fortress. It was a field. The system responded on the second day after the irrigation was started. New skill. Water management. Level 1. Description. The skill's owner distributes water more efficiently during irrigation. Water loss is reduced by 15%. Another skill that no one else had. Because no one built irrigation systems. Because everyone prayed to the rain goddess. While Daniel was building the water collection system, something else happened. In his main field, the soil's vitality had surpassed 20. The compost was working. The crop rotation was working. The legumes were pumping out nitrogen. The mulch was retaining moisture and regulating temperature. And on the 21st day of the 4th month, a new sprout appeared among the wheat and daisies. Not silvery, reddish, with dense, stiff leaves and a short, thick stem. Daniel activated Soil Insight and read, Field Fireflower, Magical Crop, Rank D, Properties. When consumed, the fruits provide a temporary 20% boost to physical endurance. The effect lasts 2 hours. Growth conditions, soil vitality above 20, magical agriculture skill at least level 2, at least 8 hours of sunlight per day, rank D, 1 rank higher than moon chamomile, and properties on a completely different level. Chamomile healed scratches. Fire Blossom strengthened the body. He imagined what would happen if he gave this fruit to a soldier before battle, or to a laborer before work, or to a miner before a shift. A temporary 20% boost in stamina. That means carrying more, running farther, working longer, to fight harder. He realized something else. Chamomile cost 3 silver coins, rank E. Fireflower was rank D. Its price would be many times higher, and its value to people with swords would be incomparably greater than the value of a flower for scratches. Ariel. Daniel called her over to the field. He showed her the sprout, explained its properties. Ariel looked at the reddish plant and was silent for a long time. Then she said quietly that if anyone found out about this plant, it wouldn't be merchants coming to the village. It would be guilds, orders, maybe an army. Daniel nodded. He knew. Ariel said that a single sword wouldn't stop a guild. Daniel said he knew that too, and that he had time. Fire Blossom ripens in a month. The fruit would be ready by the end of the 5th month. By that time, the security issue needed to be resolved. Ariel asked how. Daniel said he didn't know yet, but he would figure it out. He always solved problems the same way. First, he understood the problem. Then he looked for resources. Then he built a system. The problem was clear. The farm was defenseless. Resources were limited. One night, 17 old people and children. No wall, no garrison. A system. He needed a system that would protect the farm without an army. He thought about it for 3 days. He walked the perimeter. He studied the terrain. He looked at the hills, at the road, at the thickets around the village. On the third day, he found the answer in his own field. Among the weeds at the far edge of the plot grew a prickly vine with long, tenacious tendrils. The system identified it as prickly ivy, a useless weed, fast-growing, aggressive, takes over territory in weeks, thorns sharp as needles. Daniel looked at the ivy and smiled. A useless weed, fast-growing, aggressive, sharp thorns, perfect. He gathered cuttings, dozens of cuttings, and began planting them along the village perimeter, in 2 rows, a step apart. Ariel asked why he was planting thorns. Daniel said that in 2 months these thorns would grow into a chest-high wall, dense, impassable without an axe, with thorns that tear through skin and clothing. A living hedge, not a stone wall but better than nothing. And it grows on its own, and repairs itself, and doesn't require a garrison. Ariel looked at the cuttings, at Daniel, and smiled. For the first time in a long while, she said he thinks like a commander. Only instead of soldiers, he has plants. Daniel said that plants are more reliable. They don't desert. They don't ask for pay. They don't fall asleep on duty. Ariel snorted. It was a sound he hadn't heard from her before. Almost a laugh. They worked together. Ariel dug holes for the cuttings. Daniel planted and watered. By evening, the entire northern perimeter was planted. The next day, the southern one, then the eastern one. He left the western side open. There was a road there and the only entrance to the village. He fortified the entrance differently. Double gates made of logs that Thorn helped cut down. A ditch in front of the gates, through. It wouldn't stop a horseman, but it would slow down a foot soldier. Trivialities. Each one on its own meant nothing. Together, they gave the village a chance. While he was building the defenses, the wheat in the second experimental field ripened. He harvested it by hand, with a sickle. Ariel helped tie the sheaves. Widow Larson came with the children. Thorn brought a cart. The whole village gathered the first harvest of a farmer from another world. The result exceeded expectations. The field, 30 paces by 20, yielded a harvest that, according to Daniel's calculations, was 3 times the norm for this region. The grain was large, full, heavy. The system rated the quality as Veer. Mira held a handful of grain and silently ran her fingers through it. Then she said that in 40 years she had never seen wheat like this in Lowenfield. Never. Daniel said that this was only the beginning, that next season he would select the best grains from this harvest and plant only those, and the next harvest would be even better. Selection. Choosing the best. Generation after generation. Every season the grain grows larger and stronger. Mira listened and her hands trembled, not from weakness. The syrup had long since done its job, and she was healthier than she had been in the last 5 years. Her hands trembled for another reason, from understanding that this guy wasn't just a farmer, that he hadn't come here by chance, that behind his calm words lay knowledge that no one else in this world possessed. She didn't say it out loud, but Daniel could see it in her eyes. That evening, he sat by the fire with Ariel. The wheat had been threshed and the sheaves into the barn. The fireweed in the field was coming into bloom. The prickly ivy along the perimeter had sent out its first shoots. The irrigation system was working. The compost was maturing. Moon daisies bloomed silver in the moonlight. 4 months. From nothing. From a sack of poor grain in an empty village. Ariel chewed on a cracker and stared into the fire. Then she said that in the order they had told her that strength was a sword, that honor was battle, that a knight's purpose was to kill those who threatened. She had believed that for 10 years. Then she saw that the order killed the unarmed and realized they had lied to her. She left, and didn't know why to live. And now she was sitting by the fire next to a farmer who had grown a field from dead earth and protected the village with thorns. And for the first time in a year, she understood why to hold a sword, not to kill, so that this field stand. Daniel listened in silence. Then he said that tomorrow there would be stewed meat with hot peppers, especially for her. Ariel looked at him. The fire was reflected in her eyes. She said nothing, but she didn't look away. It was the 4th month. Winter lay ahead. Drought lay ahead. People lay ahead who would find out about his farm and want to take it away. But tonight the sky was clear, and the stars were close, and grain lay in the barn, and a miracle was growing in the field. Daniel looked at the fire and thought that somewhere on the highway in A, his wrecked pickup truck lay, and that he didn't want to go back. The 5th month began with a visit Daniel had both been waiting for and dreading. Felis had returned, but not alone. 2 men in gray cloaks followed his wagon, strong, silent, with short swords at their belts. Felis looked nervous. He jumped down from the wagon and approached Daniel with a smile that sat crookedly and awkwardly on his face. He said he'd brought the glass as promised, 4 sheets, and that representatives from the Westmere Trading House had come with him. They wanted to talk about flowers. Daniel looked at the men in gray cloaks. They were standing by the cart, surveying the village, the field, the fence of young, thorny ivy, the barn. Ariel came out from behind the house with a sword at her belt. She stood next to Daniel, silently. The people in the cloaks exchanged glances. One of them stepped forward. He introduced himself as Marcus, a representative of the Graven Trading House from Westmere. He said he'd heard about the moon daisies, that he wanted to sign a contract, an exclusive supply deal. All the flowers would go through the Graven House. In return, the house would provide protection and a steady market. Marcus's voice was even and businesslike. He spoke like a man accustomed to never being refused. Daniel listened. He asked about the terms. Marcus named his price. 1.5 silver coins per flower. Daniel sold them to Felicia for 2.25. 1.5 was an insult. Daniel said the price was too low. Marcus smiled and said the price was fair, considering the costs of logistics and security, and that the alternative was worse. Without a contract with the House of Graven, the farm would be left unprotected in a region where bandits burn villages every season. It was a threat, a polite one, a subtle one, wrapped in business language, but a threat. Ariel placed her hand on the hilt of her sword. The second man in the cloak shifted slightly to the side, hand on his hip, ready. Daniel raised his palm, calmly. He looked at Marcus and said he would think it over, that he would give an answer in a week, that for now, he could offer the guests dinner and lodging. Marcus blinked. He had clearly expected a different reaction, fear or agreement. He got politeness and a delay. He nodded. He agreed to dinner. Daniel cooked it himself. Porridge with meat and herbs, fresh bread from Widow Larson, honey from Thorn, milk, a salad of greens from his garden. Marcus ate in silence. So did his partner. They exchanged glances. The food was better than at most roadside inns. Between bites, Marcus asked where a country farmer had acquired such skills. Daniel said he learned it from his grandmother. Marcus didn't believe him, but didn't argue. After lunch, the guests left. Felis lingered. He took Daniel aside and said quietly that he was wasting his time. The House of Graven isn't the type to wait. Behind them stands the Grain Trade Guild, and behind the guild stands Lord Gavin Drummond, the man who controls 60% of the food market in the kingdom. If Drummond decides that the farm in Loughtonfield threatens his business, he won't send 2 men in cloaks. He'll send 200. Daniel thanked Felis for the warning. He paid for the glass. 4 sheets. A bit cloudy, with bubbles, but clear. Good enough. Felis left. Ariel stood at the gate and watched the cart drive away. Then she said that Marcus's partner had the hands of a killer. Not a soldier. A killer. Short nails. A callus on his index finger from a throwing knife. She'd seen people like that in the Order. People for dirty work. Daniel nodded. He'd had a week. He'd put it to good use. First, the greenhouse. 4 sheets of glass became the roof of a wooden frame he'd assembled in 2 days. The greenhouse was small, 3 by 2 feet, but inside it was 10 degrees warmer than outside, enough to extend the season by a month, enough to grow seedlings in winter. He transplanted 2 fire blossom sprouts into the greenhouse, covered them with glass, watered them, and waited. Second, he brought up the status window and studied every skill, every description, every condition. He was looking for something that would help with defense, and he found it. The second-level seed-gathering skill granted a secondary ability, plant analysis. It allowed him to see the hidden properties of any plant within a 10-step radius. He went outside the village and began scanning everything in sight. Every bush, every blade of grass, every weed. 3 hours of work and 100 plants. Most were ordinary. Grass, weeds, moss. But 3 finds were worth all the time spent. The first, sleepy vine. An unremarkable plant with small blue flowers. Property. When inhaled, the pollen causes drowsiness for 10 minutes. harmless. The effect wears off after an hour. Second, bitter root, a thick, knotty root under a bush by the stream. Property. The sap causes severe burning and itching when it comes into contact with the skin, not poisonous. The effect lasts 6 hours. Third, firefly grass, a slender, tall grass with white panicles. Property. When struck, it emits a bright flash of light. Duration, 2 seconds. Radius, 3 paces. Sleepy vine, bitter root, firefly grass. 3 plants that any farmer or warrior would walk right past without a second glance. Useless weeds. Daniel stood in the middle of the meadow, looking at his finds, and a plan began to form in his mind. The sleep vine can be dried to collect its pollen. Spray it over a group of people. 10 minutes of sleep, enough to tie them up. Bitter root can be ground up and added to oil. Rub it on the fence ropes. Anyone who climbs over the fence will get 6 hours of unbearable itching. Firefly grass can be planted along the path to the village. Anyone who steps on it at night will get a flash of light. Alarm system. 3 plants, 3 lines of defense, without a single sword. He collected samples of all 3 and brought them to the farm, he told Ariel. The knight listened, and an expression slowly appeared on her face, the one he saw when she looked at sound tactics. She said it was madness, and that it might work. For the next 3 days they worked together. Ariel marked out the positions. She knew how the attackers thought, where they would go, where they would strike, where they would retreat. Daniel planted firefly grass along the path from the road, sleepy vine by the gate. He treated the ropes on the fence with bitter root. The thorny ivy along the perimeter had already grown 1/2 meter high. In a month it would be waist high. In 2 months, chest high. The village was slowly turning into a fortress. A green, living, silent fortress that grew on its own. A week passed. Marcus did not return for an answer. Another man came in his place, alone, without a cloak, in fine traveling clothes with a silver buckle on his belt. He did not introduce himself as an assistant or a messenger. He said his name was Lord Gavin Drummond, head of the Grain Trade Guild, and that he wanted to talk. Daniel hadn't expected this. The head of the guild in person, in a remote village. That meant one of 2 things. Either the farm was more important than he thought, or Drummond was the type to handle matters personally. It turned out to be both. Drummond was a man of about 45, tall, lean, with a short beard and intelligent gray eyes. He moved like a man accustomed to rooms falling silent when he entered, but without arrogance. Rather, with the weary confidence of a man who had long ago realized that the world works a certain way and has no intention of pretending otherwise. Daniel offered him tea. Drummond accepted. They sat down at a table in the courtyard. Ariel stood by the door, her hand on her sword. Drummond looked at her and said he had come unarmed and without men. His carriage was parked on the road, a coachman and 1 servant, that's all. He hadn't come to threaten, he had come to understand. Daniel poured the tea. He waited. Drummond took a sip. He looked out at the field, at the silvery daisies, at the reddish fire blossom in the greenhouse, at the system of irrigation channels, at the compost pit, at the thorny ivy on the fence, and said he was impressed. Then he spoke seriously. He said he controlled grain shipments to 12 cities, that his warehouses fed 40,000 people, that his guild provided work for 2,000 people. Carriers, warehouse workers, loaders, millers, bakers. He had been building this system for 20 years, and he sees that in 4 months, Daniel has grown on a small plot of land, something that could bring down the grain market across the entire region. Magical fruits of enhancement, yields 3 times higher than normal. Methods no one has ever seen. If this spreads, if other farmers learn to do the same, prices. Grain prices will plummet, his warehouses will empty, his people will be out of work. The 40,000 hungry mouths he feeds now will be left without bread. Not because there will be less bread, but because the system that delivers it will break down. He spoke calmly, without malice, with the gravity of a man who bears responsibility for thousands of lives. And Daniel listened and understood that Drummond wasn't lying, nor was he exaggerating. He truly saw the problem, and the problem was real. Daniel finished his tea. He set down his mug, and said he understood. That Drummond was right, that a sudden shift in the market would destroy the existing system, and that he didn't want that. Drummond raised an eyebrow. He hadn't expected that. Daniel said he wasn't going to disrupt the market. He wasn't going to give away secrets. He wasn't going to flood the cities with cheap grain. He wanted to feed people, starting with this village. then the neighboring ones, then those who were starving. And many would be starving because the drought wouldn't end this year, or next year. He said he could tell from the soil and the water that the next 2 or 3 years would be hard, that the kingdom's grain reserves would run out by the middle of next year, if not sooner. That Drummond, with all his warehouses, wouldn't be able to feed 40,000 people when there simply wouldn't be any grain. Drummond was silent, his face turned to stone. He knew about the drought. Of course he knew. He was a grain merchant. He counted his stocks every day, and he didn't like the numbers. Daniel said he was offering not war but an alliance. He wouldn't touch Drummond's market. He wouldn't sell grain in his cities. He wouldn't teach other farmers. For now. In return, Drummond wouldn't touch his farm. He wouldn't send the Marcuses or men with short swords. And when the drought really hit, when the granaries ran empty, when prices soared so high that the poor began to die, then they would sit down at this table again and talk about how to work together to feed the people who otherwise wouldn't survive. Drummond looked at him for a long time. A minute, two. The tea was getting cold. Ariel stood motionless by the door. Then Drummond stood up. He said he accepted a truce. Not an alliance, a truce. And that time would tell which of them was right. He turned and walked toward the inn. He stopped at the gate, turned around, and said that Daniel was the first farmer he'd met who thought like a lord. Daniel replied that he was the first lord he'd met who listened to a farmer. Drummond smiled. He left. Ariel approached Daniel and said that this truce would last exactly until the first hunger riot in his cities. Daniel said he knew, but he needed time, and Drummond had given him time. That was enough. That evening he sat alone, not by the fire, in the outbuilding, by the light and oil lamp, and he thought about what Drummond had said. If you give out the fruit for free, my thousands of workers will be left without bread, boy. You're a hero to one village and an executioner to 10. He didn't sleep that night, or the next one either. On the third night, Mira came to him, old, quiet, with a mug of hot tea. She set it down in front of him. She said she could see he wasn't sleeping. She said she knew that look on his face. Her husband had looked like that when he was carrying more on his shoulders than he could lift. Daniel took the mug. He took a sip and told Grandma Mira that he was afraid of making a mistake, that every decision he made affected more than just this village, that he didn't know how to feed everyone without hurting anyone. Mira sat down beside him. She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "You can't feed everyone. You can feed those who are right in front of you. The rest will work itself out." Daniel looked at her, at the old woman who had lived in a village at the edge of the world for 40 years, who coughed up blood and treated herself with weeds, who buried the farmers one by one, and who told him the simplest and most correct thing in the world. He finished the decoction, lay down, and finally fell asleep. The 6th month. The village was no longer starving. Not right away, not in a single day. But by the start of the 6th month, Daniel had counted the supplies and realized there would be enough for the winter. Wheat in the barn, vegetables in the cellar, salted cabbage in barrels, honey, goat's milk and cheese, which he had taught Widow Larson to make using the simplest recipe, dried herbs, dried mushrooms, smoked goat meat. The people in the village had stopped counting the days until the next harvest. For the first time in years, Daniel watched this and thought that for a man of the 21st century, it was ridiculous. Basic things: crop rotation, compost, mulch, drainage, food storage. Nothing complicated. But here, it was a miracle. The fire blossom in the greenhouse ripened on the 20th day of the 6th month. 5 fruits, small, red, the size of a cherry, warm to the touch. The system identified them as field fire blossoms. Quality, good. Market value, 15 silver per piece. 15 silver, 5 pieces. 75 silver, almost 8 gold, for 5 small berries. Daniel held them in his palm and thought that Ariel was right. These aren't flowers for scratches. This is a resource people kill for. He didn't sell them. He hid 4 berries in a secret compartment under the barn floor. He gave the 5th to Ariel. She looked at the red berry. She asked why. Daniel said it was a fruit that boosts endurance. 2 hours, 20%. He wanted her to try it and tell him how she felt. If they ever had to defend themselves, he needed to know how the fruit worked on a real fighter. Ariel nodded. She ate it. She closed her eyes. She opened them a minute later. She stood up. She went to the backyard. She grabbed her sword, and she started training. Daniel watched. The difference was visible to the naked eye. She moved faster. Not by much, but noticeably. Her strikes were harder. Her breathing was steadier. She trained for 2 hours without stopping. She usually took a break after 40 minutes. When the effect wore off, she stopped. She stuck the sword into the ground. She turned to Daniel and said one word. "It works." Then she paused and added that if she'd had 10 of those berries in her last battle for the Order, she wouldn't have lost. Daniel remembered. 10 berries. 1 warrior. The difference between victory and defeat. He counted his resources. 4 fruits in the cache. A new harvest in a month. Not enough yet. But the system was growing. His magical agriculture skill was already at level 3. He could grow fire blossoms on purpose. He could control the conditions. He could increase the yield. Time was on his side. Meanwhile, rumors about the farm were spreading. Felis was a merchant, and merchants talk. The moon daisies he sold in Westmere were attracting attention. People asked where they came from. Felis kept quiet, but not all of his customers did. By the middle of the 6th month, the first strangers arrived at the village. Not merchants, not guild members, ordinary people. Peasants from neighboring villages. The first to arrive was an old man from the village of Haddonfield, a half-day's journey away. He said he'd heard about a farmer who'd grown a magical flower. He said his wife had a sore on her leg that hadn't healed in 3 months. He asked if it was true that the moon daisy could heal it. Daniel examined him. Thin, pale, clothes patched, boots worn through to the soles. He'd walked half a day on foot for the sake of hope. Daniel gave him 2 flowers. For free. He explained how to grind them into a paste and apply it. The old man looked at the flowers in his hands and his lips trembled. He reached into his belt, pulled out 3 copper coins, all he had, held them out to Daniel. Daniel pushed his hand away and said there was no need, that he should go home and treat his wife. The old man left. A week later he returned, with his wife. The sore on her leg had healed. The woman was limping, but the wound was clean and pink. She brought a basket of eggs and a homespun scarf. She placed them in front of Daniel and bowed. Daniel took the eggs and said thank you. He gave the scarf to Mira. Then a woman with a child came from the village to the east. The child had been coughing for a month. Daniel prepared a syrup, the same as for Mira, honey and herbs. The child stopped coughing in 5 days. Then a man came with a burn on his hand, a blacksmith from Haddonfield. Daniel treated the burn with a silverweed ointment and applied chamomile. It healed in 3 days. Every time he did the same thing. He looked at the person. He understood what they needed. He made a specific remedy for a specific problem. Not medicine in general. Medicine for that specific person. Syrup for Grandma Mira. Ointment for the blacksmith. A decoction for a child. Slightly different every time. Always exactly right for the task. Word spread. By the end of the 6th month, 2 or 3 people a week were coming to Loughtonfield. For treatment, for advice, for seeds. Daniel gave them. He didn't sell them. He gave them away. Mira grumbled. She said he was giving everything away and soon they wouldn't have any left for themselves. Daniel said that chamomiles grew faster than he could give them away, that every person he helped would tell 10 others, and that when real trouble came, he would need these people on his side. Mira shook her head, but she didn't argue. Ariel was unhappy too. She said that every new person was a potential mouth to feed, that sooner or later, it wouldn't be peasants with sores coming here, but people with swords and specific intentions. Daniel knew she was right. But he couldn't turn down an old man who had walked half a day for his wife. He couldn't refuse a mother with a coughing child. He couldn't and wouldn't. That was his principle. And he understood that this principle would one day lead to trouble. But without that principle, he wouldn't be a farmer. He'd be a merchant. On the 25th day of the 6th month, Ariel went out to the road for supplies and came running back. Her face was stern. Her hand was on her sword. She said she'd seen a detachment on the road. 8 men on horseback, armor, weapons. No banners, heading toward Loughtonfield. Daniel didn't panic. He had been preparing for this. He gathered the villagers, Mira, Thorn, Larson's widow, the children to the barn cellar, the women to join them, Thorn with a pitchfork at the gate, Ariel with a sword. Daniel scattered dried sleepvine pollen into 3 clay pots. He placed them on the wall by the gate. He checked the fireweed on the path. He checked the prickly ivy. He took a single fire blossom fruit from the hiding place and gave it to Ariel. She ate it in silence. A minute later, he saw her shoulders straighten and her grip on the hilt change. They waited. The squad appeared an hour later. 8 horsemen. Daniel watched from the barn roof. They rode down the path confidently. They weren't sneaking. They weren't hiding. They rode like masters. The one in front dismounted at the gate. A tall man, in chainmail. an axe at his belt. He knocked on the gate and shouted for it to be opened. That they were from the Grey Spear Mercenary Guild, that they needed the farmer, a conversation. Daniel climbed down from the roof. He walked up to the gate, opened it, stepped out, alone. Ariel was behind him, by the wall. The mercenary looked down at him. He asked if he was the farmer who grew magical flowers. Daniel said he was. The mercenary nodded. He said they'd been sent by a man from Westmere. He didn't give a name. The task was simple. Take the entire harvest of magical plants. Burn the field. The guy could go wherever he wanted, but the farm had to disappear. Daniel stood and listened. His heart beat steadily. He had been waiting for this. He had been preparing. And yet, when the moment came, a chill ran through him. 8 armed men. Against a single knight and an old man with a pitchfork. The odds were stacked against them. Daniel looked the mercenary in the eye and told him he was offering them a chance to turn around and leave. The mercenary laughed. So did the other 7. Daniel raised his hand. Ariel hurled a clay pot filled with sleepy vine pollen. The pot shattered at the feet of the front row of horses. A cloud of fine bluish pollen rose into the air. The 3 nearest mercenaries inhaled it. A minute later, the first one swayed in the saddle. The second rubbed his eyes. The third began to fall sideways. His horse jerked to the side and bolted. The remaining 5 recoiled. They drew their weapons. The leader yelled that it was a trap. Ariel stepped out from behind the wall, sword in her right hand, eyes cold. Firelight coursed through her veins. She moved quickly, so quickly that the first mercenary didn't have time to raise his shield. She struck his arm with the flat of her blade. The axe flew out of his hand. She spun around. A second blow to the legs of the next one. He fell. She didn't kill him. She maimed them. Precisely. Professionally. 5 became 2 in 10 seconds. The remaining 2 looked at the knight standing before them, not even out of breath. They looked at their 3 comrades lying on the ground, at the 2 writhing in pain, at the farmer standing calmly by the gate, looking at them without fear. They turned their horses and rode away. Ariel lowered her sword. She turned to Daniel. She was breathing heavily, but not from exhaustion, from adrenaline. She said these weren't the best mercenaries, average, and that next time they'd send the best. Daniel nodded. He walked over to the sleeping men. 3 men were snoring on the ground. He took their weapons, 3 axes and 2 knives. He bandaged the wounded, 2 with bruises and 1 with a dislocated shoulder. Nothing serious. When the men woke up an hour later, Daniel was standing before them. Their weapons lay in a pile at his feet. He told them he was letting them go, that they could take their weapons and leave. But they were to tell whoever sent them one thing. The farm stands. It will stand. And anyone who comes with a sword will leave without one. The mercenaries gathered their weapons. They gathered their comrades. And they left. In silence. Without looking back. Thorne stood at the gate with a pitchfork and watched it all with the expression of a man who sees the world turning upside down. The children came out of the cellar. The widow Larson's son ran up to Ariel and asked if he could touch the sword. Ariel looked at the boy, at his round face and big eyes, and she let him. That evening, dinner, no one spoke. They ate in silence. Daniel had made stewed meat. Ariel ate hers with pepper, Mira with bread, the children with a side dish. The silence wasn't scary, it was different. The silence of people who had learned today that they could protect their home. Daniel went to bed late. Before sleeping, he checked the status window. Level 4, new skill, farm command. Level 1, description. Settlers who recognize the farm owner as their leader receive a 5% bonus to the efficiency of any work. The system considered the village his farm, and the people in it his team. He closed the window, he lay down, and thought that in 6 months in this world, he had gone from a guy with a sack of bad grain to a man whom the merchant guilds were trying to destroy. It was progress. Strange, dangerous, but progress. The 7th month brought to Loughtonfield the first person Daniel hadn't expected and couldn't have foreseen. The girl appeared at dawn, small, thin, with a long black braid down to her waist, a knapsack on her shoulders stuffed with pouches and bundles. Her eyes were dark and quick. She walked along the path not like a peasant woman seeking help. She walked like someone who knew exactly where she was going. Ariel spotted her first. She went out to the gate. The girl stopped. She looked at the knight with the sword, at the thorny ivy on the fence, already as tall as a person, at the field beyond the village with its silvery and reddish patches of magical crops, and she said she was looking for a farmer, that very one, who had grown moon chamomile on dead soil. Ariel asked why. The girl said she wanted to see it with her own eyes, because it was impossible. Ariel led her to Daniel. He was standing by the greenhouse checking the seedlings. The girl approached. She introduced herself. Ha-Un Park, a wandering herbalist, from the eastern lands, the daughter of refugees. She had been walking for 3 weeks, following rumors passed from village to village. A farmer in the south, magical flowers, heals people with weeds. She didn't believe a single rumor. She came to check it out. Daniel looked at her, at the pouches on her belt, at her hands stained with herbal juice, at the look that didn't ask for help, but demanded proof. He said he'd show her. He led her around the farm, showed her the experimental plots, explained the principle of crop rotation. He showed her the compost pit. He showed her the irrigation system. He showed her the moon chamomiles, the fire blossoms. He demonstrated how the soil understanding skill worked. He summoned the status window in front of her. She looked at the numbers and turned pale. Not from fear, from understanding. She was a herbalist, self-taught. She had spent her whole life gathering wild plants and making medicine from them. But she had never considered that plants could just be gathered, but also cultivated, purposefully, controlling the conditions, managing the quality. Daniel showed her a garden bed where chamomile and peas grew side by side. He explained the symbiosis. Legumes provide nitrogen. The chamomile gets nourishment. The flower's quality is higher. Its properties are stronger. Ha-Un crouched over the garden bed. She touched the soil. She sniffed it. She rubbed it between her fingers. She looked up at Daniel and asked how he knew all this. Daniel said it was from his grandmother. Ha-Un said his grandmother was a genius. Daniel smiled and didn't argue. Ha-Un stayed for the night, then for a second night. On the third day, she came to him in the morning and said she wanted to stay. Not as a guest, as a worker. She wants to learn. She wants to understand how he does what he does. And she can be useful. She knows about 300 species of wild herbs. She knows where they grow, what properties they have, how to harvest them, how to dry them, how to blend them, Daniel thought. A herbalist who knows the local flora. Someone who understands plants on a practical level. An ally with intelligence and drive. He said yes. Ha-Un smiled, for the first time in 3 days. Quietly, quickly, like a flash of light, and she began to unpack her knapsack. Inside were 27 types of dried herbs. 11 of them Daniel didn't know and had never seen in this world. Ha-Un talked about each one. Daniel listened and took notes. They talked late into the night. He learned more about local botany in 1 night than in 6 months of independent research. Ha-Un knew things that weren't in the system. Common names, flowering seasons, herb compatibility, contraindications. All this had been passed down from generation to generation among herbalists and hadn't made it into any books. Daniel told her about fungal symbiosis, about the mycelium that connects tree roots and transfers nutrients, about how mycelium can enhance the absorption of moisture and minerals. Ha-Un listened without blinking. Then she said that in the eastern forests, mushrooms grow that always appear near certain trees. The locals considered it a coincidence, or a sign from the spirits. Daniel said that it was mycorrhiza, a symbiosis between the mycelium and the roots, and that if one learned to control it, one could double the yield of any tree and any plant near it. Ha-Un dropped her teacup. She picked it up. She apologized. Her hands were shaking. She asked if it could be done here, on this land. Daniel said he was going to try. He needed the right mushroom. Ha-Un said she knew where to find it. In the forest east of the village, mushrooms with purple caps grow. The locals consider them inedible, but they always appear at the roots of old oak trees. They went there the next morning. The forest was an hour's walk away. Old, dark, oaks 3 arms wide, moss on the rocks, the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. Daniel activated plant analysis and began scanning. The mushrooms were found quickly. Purple caps with white gills. The system identified them. Purple root fungus. Symbiotic mushroom type. Property. Forms a mycelial network with the root systems of trees. Increases the absorption of moisture and mana from the soil by 30%. Mana. Daniel reread it. Mana. A symbiotic mushroom that helps plants absorb magical energy from the soil. He stood in the forest, looking at the purple caps, and thought about how this changes everything. Moon daisies absorb mana to become magical. Fire blossoms absorb mana to bear fruits of enhancement. The more mana, the stronger the plant. The stronger the plant, the more valuable the fruit. And this mushroom increases mana absorption by 30%. He carefully dug up 3 mushrooms with a clump of soil, brought them to the farm, planted them next to the fire flower. He watered them, and waited. Ha-un sat nearby, watching with the expression of a scientist observing an experiment that could change the paradigm. On the 3rd day, Daniel checked the fire flower next to the mushroom. The soil's vitality in that spot was 8 points higher than in the neighboring bed. The plant's mana absorption had increased, not by 30%, by 42. The mushroom and the fire flower were enhancing each other. The system displayed a notification. Mycelial symbiosis detected. New skill, mushroom farming, level 1. Description: the skill holder can cultivate symbiotic mushrooms to enhance magical crops. Bonus to mana absorption, plus 20% base. Scales with skill level. Ha-un looked at the status window over his shoulder. He let her see. She read it, reread it, looked at the mushroom, at Fire Blossom, at Daniel, and said quietly that her mother had died of a fever when Ha-un was 12. There was no herbalist in their village. The nearest one lived 3 days' journey away. A remedy could have been made from a root that grew in the forest behind their house, but no one knew. No one. Her mother died of an illness that could have been cured by a herb growing 50 paces from her bed. Ha-un became an herbalist that day. She swore she would know every plant, that no one would ever die from ignorance near her again. And here she stands, next to a man who doesn't just know plants. He grows them, controls them, enhances them, creates new ones. He does what she has dreamed of her whole life. She fell silent, turned away. Daniel saw her shoulders shaking. He didn't approach her, didn't try to comfort her. He simply said that in the morning they would begin planting the mycelium across the entire field, and that he needed her help because she knew the local mushrooms better than anyone. Ha-un nodded without turning around. She wiped her face with her sleeve and went to make tea. She always made tea when she didn't know what to say. Daniel noticed that her tea was different, not just hot water with leaves, a blend of herbs chosen with precision, mild, warming, with a slight bitterness and a honeyed aftertaste. He drank it and realized it was the best tea he'd ever tasted in either world. He told her so. Ha-un glanced at him quickly. She looked away and said it was just tea. The 8th and 9th months merged into one continuous stream of work. Daniel and Ha-un laid a mycelial network across all the beds with magical crops. The purple rhizome had taken root. Violet caps poked out of the ground between the rows of fire blossoms and moon daisies. The soil's vitality in the main field had surpassed 30. The fire blossom, enhanced by the mycelium, produced fruit of a different quality. The system rated them as excellent instead of good. The stamina boosting effect increased from 20% to 28%. The duration went from 2 hours to 3. The market value of a single fruit jumped to 25 silver. Daniel didn't sell. He saved them up. He stored them in a hiding place under the barn, wrapped in dry leaves and sprinkled with ash so they would keep longer. By the end of the 9th month, he had 32 fire blossom fruits, 800 silver coins, 80 gold coins, the fortune of a minor noble, in baskets under the ceiling of the outbuilding. But there was something more important than money. A third type of magical crop had appeared in the field with a vitality rating above 35. The fruit of strength, rank C. Daniel stared at the status window and read the description 3 times. The fruit of strength, rank C. When consumed, temporarily increases physical strength by 40%. Duration, 4 hours. Side effect, intense hunger after the effect wears off. Conditions for appearance, soil vitality above 35. Magical agriculture skill must be at least level 4. Presence of a mycelial network. Rank C. Temporary increase in strength by 40% for 4 hours. It was a weapon, not a fruit, a weapon. A warrior who ate this fruit would strike 1.5 times harder than usual. 4 hours. That's enough for any battle, for any siege, for any assault. Daniel stood over the sprout with its fleshy dark green leaves and red stem and realized he had crossed the line. The moon daisy healed scratches. The fire blossom provided stamina. The fruit of strength granted combat superiority. Each successive rank isn't just more valuable than the last, it's more dangerous. For him. When Ariel found out, she was silent for a long time. Then she said that the fruit of power was worth 5 gold pieces apiece on the black market. Families were slaughtered for that kind of money. Daniel said he knew, and that no one would find out. Ariel asked how he planned to hide the field, which was visible from the hill. Daniel said he wasn't going to hide the field. He planned to make it so that for those who came for the fruit, It would be more profitable to trade than to rob. Ariel shook her head. She said he trusted people too much. Daniel said he trusted hunger. Hunger makes people compliant, and the drought wasn't ending. He was right. The rains didn't come in the 8th month. Not at all. The sky was empty and hot. The stream had shrunk to a thin trickle. The wells in the neighboring villages began to dry up. The first rumors of a grain shortage came from the north. Flour prices in Westmere doubled in a month. Daniel watched it all and calculated. His pond was full. The irrigation system was working. The mulch retained moisture. The mycelium drew water from deep layers. His farm drank while everything around it withered. He expanded his crops. A new field, 50 paces by 30, the largest one. Wheat and vegetables. Ordinary, not magical. Food. Simple food for the winter, because winter would be harsh, and he knew it. Ariel helped dig. Haun helped plant. Mira commanded the villagers. Thorn hauled water. The children weeded. The whole village worked. 18 people now. Haun had become the 18th. Reputation in Lowenfield, high. Farm management skill, level 2. 10% efficiency bonus. People worked better alongside him. Not because the system provided the numbers, because they believed in what they were doing. For the first time. In the 9th month, the first refugees arrived. A family of 5. A man, a woman, 3 children, from a village to the north. The well had dried up. The harvest was ruined. They had walked for 3 days. The children were quiet and wide-eyed. The woman carried the youngest in her arms. The man was limping. They stood at the gate and didn't ask for anything. They just stood there. Daniel went out to them. He looked at the children, at their sunken cheeks and chapped lips. He led them to the well. He gave them water. He gave them bread. He gave them a place in an empty house on the edge of the village, the former home of the 3rd farmer, the one who hanged himself. Mira pulled him aside. She said they couldn't take everyone in, that their supplies wouldn't be enough, that every extra mouth meant less food for their own. Daniel said there was no such thing as your own. There were people you'd fed and people you hadn't fed yet. Mira said he was crazy. Daniel said maybe, but these children would eat. Mira left. She slammed the door. An hour later, she returned with blankets for the refugees. She didn't say a word. Daniel didn't thank her. He knew Mira wasn't angry at him. She was angry at a world where children go hungry. Over the next 3 weeks, 2 more families arrived. Then a lonely old man. Then a woman with an infant. The village grew. 23 people. 27. 30. Daniel counted the supplies every evening. There was enough wheat. There were enough vegetables. There was an abundance of honey. The goats were being milked. The chickens were laying eggs. The new field promised a harvest in a month. He held on. He balanced things out, every day deciding who would get what and how much. Ariel said he was like a commander leading a siege from the inside. Only instead of enemies behind the wall, there was winter. Daniel said that winter was worse than any enemy. You can negotiate with an enemy. With winter, you cannot. Meanwhile, Haeun made a discovery of her own. She was experimenting with drying magical plants. Moon chamomile lost its properties after 7 days. Standard system information. But Haeun had been drying herbs her whole life. She knew 10 preservation methods. She tried slow drying in the shade at a low temperature with a layer of a specific type of moss. The result? Moon chamomile. Dried. Shelf life? 90 days. 70% of properties retained. 70% effectiveness, but 3 months of storage instead of a week. This meant the produce could be transported, stored, sold over long distances, build up stockpiles. When Daniel saw the result, he looked at Haeun and said that she had just solved the logistical problem that had tied his entire farm to one location. Haeun said it was just proper drying. Daniel said that proper drying had just become a strategic resource. Haeun blushed. She quickly turned away and went to make tea. They sat until dawn. Daniel explained preservation to her. Fermentation, salting, smoking, principles that worked on Earth and should work here. Haeun listened and wrote in her notebook in small, neat handwriting. She asked questions that made Daniel freeze because they were precise and profound. She asked if fermentation could alter the magical properties of the fruit rather than just preserve them. Daniel didn't know, but the question was valid. They decided to test it. Haeun set a batch of fire blossoms to ferment, the fruits in a clay pot, a layer of honey, a layer of specific leaves that, in her experience, enhanced the process. A lid, a dark, cool place. 30 days. They would see the result in the 10th month. Meanwhile, Mira's song appeared quietly, the way people who are used to being inconspicuous appear. She came with a 3rd group of refugees, short, round-faced, with dark braids and eyes that looked at the floor. She was 17. Her father, a blacksmith, was killed by bandits when she was a child. Her mother died of starvation last year. She had been walking alone for 2 weeks. She ate whatever she could find. She drank from puddles. When Daniel saw her, she weighed about 40 kilograms. Her ribs stuck out under her shirt. He led her to the table. He gave her bread, milk, porridge. She ate slowly, in small bites, like someone who hadn't eaten in a long time and was afraid her stomach wouldn't handle it. Daniel sat down next to her and remained silent until she had finished eating. Then he asked if she knew how to do anything. Mira looked at him. There was so much of that familiar expectation of rejection in her eyes that Daniel's throat tightened. She said she didn't know how to do anything. Not a mage, not a warrior, not a beauty, not a herbalist. Nothing. Daniel was silent. Then he asked if she could count. Mira nodded. Read, she nodded. Write, she nodded. Quickly. Her father had taught her. Daniel took out his notes. Rags of paper scribbled all over. Crop observations, planting dates, germination dates, sizes, color, behavior, reaction to watering, reaction to fertilizer. Hundreds of entries, haphazard, chaotic. He didn't have time to keep them neat. He placed the notes in front of Mira and said he needed someone to keep an observation journal. Every day, every plant, every parameter, neatly, accurately, without omissions. This is the most important job on the farm because without records, he cannot select the best plants. He cannot repeat successes. He cannot learn from mistakes. All his science is based on data, and the data depends on the person who records it. Mira looked at him, then at the records, then at him, and she said quietly that she just knew how to write, that it wasn't a skill, that anyone could do it. Daniel leaned toward her and said that no, not anyone. Many people know how to write. Only a few know how to observe. To notice that this sprout's leaf is 2 shades darker than yesterday, that this fruit ripened a day earlier than the rest, that after the rain, this bush has straightened up, but the one next to it hasn't. He needs someone with observant eyes and the patience to record every little detail. He asked if she could do it. Mira sat up straight, for the first time during the entire conversation. She nodded. Daniel gave her a blank notebook, a real one. He'd traded it to Phyllis for 3 daisies and a pencil. Mira took the notebook with both hands. She pressed it to her chest, like a treasure. The next morning, she went out to the field at dawn. Daniel saw her from the window. She walked between the rows, stopped at every plant, crouched down, looked, touched, smelled, wrote it down. Slowly, thoroughly, with a focus he hadn't expected from a 17-year-old girl. By evening, she brought him a filled-out page. Every plant, every parameter, date, time, seedling height, number of leaves, color, condition of the soil nearby, watering, whether it had been done or not. Daniel read it and couldn't believe it. In a single day, she had gathered more structured data than he had in a month. He looked at her and told her she was indispensable. Mira blinked. She opened her mouth. She closed it. Her hands clenched the notebook, and a smile appeared on her face. The first since she'd come to the village. Wide, unexpected. One that transformed her round face. Alive, young, real. She said she'd come tomorrow at dawn, and left. Daniel watched her go and thought that a farm isn't about the land or the plants. A farm is about people. People who find their place and flourish. Like his crops, only slower and more precious. The 10th month. The first snow fell on the hills around Loughtonfield in a thin white blanket. Daniel stood by the greenhouse and checked the temperature inside. The glass held. The fireflower in the greenhouse was growing. The moon daisies in the covered beds weren't freezing. The system compensated for some of the cold through the 3rd-level accelerated growth skill. But the usual crops in the open fields had frozen. The wheat had been harvested. The vegetables had been dug up. The granary was full. The cellars were packed. The village of 30 people was better prepared for winter than any other village in the province. And yet Daniel couldn't sleep. Because by the end of the 9th month, rumors about Loughtonfield had spread beyond the neighboring villages, Felice had told him during his last visit. In Westmere, people were talking about a farm where miracle fruits grew. In the capital's taverns, they were retelling the story of a farmer who had fought off mercenaries with sleep-inducing herbs. The Adventurers Guild had added Loughtonfield to its registry of interesting locations. This was bad. It meant that the next guests would be more serious than the Grey Spear mercenaries. On the third day of the 10th month, the serious guests arrived, not with swords, with papers. A carriage bearing the royal coat of arms stopped at the gate. A girl in a plain traveling dress stepped out. Behind her were two bodyguards. Unremarkable, professional, eyes that scanned the area like living cameras. The girl introduced herself as Celine, no last name. She said she was a researcher at the Royal Academy. She said the academy had taken an interest in rumors of magical crops grown by a farmer, and that she had been sent to assess them. Daniel looked at her. Red hair pulled back into a simple ponytail. Slender hands without calluses. A bearing you wouldn't acquire at an academy. That sort of bearing is drilled in from childhood. Court tutors. Hours with a book on one's head, a straight back, a high chin. The girl standing before him wasn't a researcher. She was someone far higher up. But Daniel said nothing. If she wants to be Celine, let her be Celine. He showed her the farm, just as he had shown Ha-un. The fields, the irrigation system, the compost, the mycelium, the magical crops. He didn't show her the status window. Celine walked beside him and asked questions. The questions were intelligent but theoretical. She knew botany from books. She knew the classification of magical plants. She knew their market value down to the penny. But when Daniel asked if she had ever planted anything with her own hands, she hesitated and said no. Daniel handed her a hoe. Celine looked at the hoe as if it were an insult, then at Daniel, then at Ariel, who was standing by the wall, smirking, then at Ha-Yun, who was hiding a smile behind a mug of tea. Then she took the hoe and tried to work. She didn't know how. Not at all. She held the hoe like an oar. Her back was hunched. The blow missed the weed and hit the garden bed. Dirt on her dress, dirt on her face, dirt in her hair. 10 minutes later, she was dirty and angry and red from the strain. Daniel stood nearby and calmly demonstrated. Like this, a short stroke, right at the root. Don't chop, slice. Celine tried, missed again. More dirt. Ariel was openly enjoying the spectacle. An hour later, Celine pulled out her first weed correctly. She held it up in front of her. She looked at the root with a clump of soil, and an expression appeared on her face that Daniel hadn't expected. Surprise. Pure, childlike surprise. She said quietly that she had never done anything with her hands in her life. Not a single thing. Everything was done for her. Everything. Always. Daniel said that now she had a pulled weed, the first thing she'd done with her own hands. Celine looked at the weed, at her dirty hands, and she laughed. Not a courtly laugh, a real one, loud, with her head thrown back. Ariel exchanged a glance with Ha-Yun. Both stopped smiling. Both understood something. Celine stayed for a week, then for a second. Her bodyguards stood at the gate and waited patiently. Celine worked in the garden beds, every day. 3 hours in the morning, 2 in the evening. She was learning, eagerly, quickly. She asked questions every minute. What is this? Why do we do it this way? Why here and not there? Can we do it differently? What will happen if... Daniel answered everyone, patiently, like a teacher. He explained crop rotation to her. She listened as if it were a revelation. He explained compost. She turned pale. She asked cautiously, "Are you saying manure? That you put manure in the ground?" Daniel said yes. Celine covered her mouth with her sleeve. She stood there, took a deep breath, and said it was fine, that she could live with it. Her voice, however, said no, she couldn't, but she would try. On the 4th day, Celine asked why he was doing this. Why was he growing magical fruits in the middle of nowhere? Why was he treating the peasants for free? Why was he taking in refugees? He could have sold his knowledge to any guild for a fortune. He could have lived in the capital. He could have worked for the crown. Why was he here? Daniel stood knee-deep in the garden bed, a shovel in his hands. He thought for a moment. Then he said it was because people were starving here, and not in the capital. He was needed here, not there. Celine was silent for a long time. Then she said that people were starving in the capital too, just quietly, behind closed doors, in beautiful rooms, from a different kind of hunger. Daniel looked at her and realized she was talking about herself. He didn't ask. He just handed her the watering can and said it was time to water the carrots in the 3rd bed. Celine took the watering can. She went to water them. And Daniel watched as she bent over the sprouts and her fingers gently touched the leaves, like someone touching something alive for the first time and afraid of breaking it. On the 10th day, Ha-Un opened the jar of fermented fire flower. 30 days in honey and herbs. The fruits had changed. They had darkened. They had softened. The scent had become rich and sweet. The system updated the information. Fermented fire flower. Quality. Excellent. Effect. Increased physical endurance by 35%. Duration. 5 hours. Side effect. Mild drowsiness after the effect wears off. Market value. 40 silver per piece. 35% instead of 28. 5 hours instead of 3. Fermentation didn't just preserve the properties, it enhanced them. Ha-Un stood over the pot, her hands trembling. She looked at Daniel and said it worked. That fermentation changes the magical structure of the fruit. That if you select the right blend of herbs for each crop, you can enhance any magical fruit. Daniel said she was right, and that now they needed to test this on the fruit of power, on the moon chamomile, on everything they had. Hei-Yun was already running to her notes. Mira recorded everything, every number, every parameter. Her notebook had grown thick with inserted pages. She kept records with a precision that surprised even Daniel. Every day, without omissions, without errors. Daniel noticed that Mira had blossomed over these 2 months. She had gained weight. Her cheeks had rounded out. Her eyes had gone from dull to lively. She laughed, loudly, unexpectedly. The children in the village ran after her because she told them stories about plants. She turned the entries from her notebook into fairy tales. This flower is silver because it was born on a moonlit night. This one is red because it is brave. The children listened with their mouths agape. Daniel listened too, and he thought that Mira had found her place. Meanwhile, Celine was becoming a problem. Not she herself, her presence. On the 12th day, one of the bodyguards stepped away. He returned 2 days later. Ariel followed him. He had gone to Westmere. He had sent a letter. Ariel told Daniel. Daniel nodded. He knew that Celine wasn't who she claimed to be. The bodyguard confirmed it. She was reporting to someone. But she didn't act like a spy. She acted like someone who, for the first time in her life, felt like her true self and was afraid it would end. Daniel decided to wait. The truth would come out on its own. On the 14th day, Celine came to him in the evening. Daniel was cooking dinner, braised meat with vegetables. He already knew she didn't like onions. He cooked her portion separately, no onions, with mild herbs. Celine sat down at the table. She looked at her plate. She looked at him, and said her name was Celine Ashton, the 3rd princess of the kingdom of Illyrion, the daughter of King Tiberius IV. Daniel placed the plate in front of her. He said he knew. Celine froze. She asked how he knew. Daniel said it was her posture, her hands, the way she spoke, the questions she asked, and the bodyguards who stood like palace guards, not like guild mercenaries. Celine lowered her eyes. She was silent. She asked quietly, "And he won't change anything now?" Daniel asked what she meant. Celine said that everyone she'd met, once they found out who she was, changed. They started bowing, or being afraid, or flattering her, or begging. She asked, "He will change." Daniel pushed a plate toward her, and said that the carrots in the 3rd bed still needed to be watered tomorrow morning. Regardless of whether she was a princess or not, Celine looked at him, at the plate, at the stewed meat without onions that he had cooked personally for her, and her lips trembled. She lowered her head, her hair fell over her face, her shoulders shook. She cried silently. Over the plate of dinner, in a village at the edge of the world, in a simple dress smeared with dirt. Daniel sat down beside her, silently. He didn't touch her. He didn't comfort her. He just sat there. A minute later, Celine wiped her face. She picked up a spoon and began to eat. Daniel stood up and went to cook for the others. Ariel stood by the door watching him, then at Celine, then back at him, and there was something new in her eyes, something Daniel didn't have time to read because he turned away. That evening was the first time everyone sat down at the same table. Ariel, Ha-Un, Mira, Celine, Mira, Thorn, Mrs. Larson and her children, the refugees. 30 people at a long table under the canopy. Daniel served the food and remembered everyone. Ariel, extra meat with pepper. Ha-Un, spices on the side. Mira, a crust of bread. Celine, no onions. The children, a second helping of porridge. Mira, the village elder, stronger broth for her throat. Thorn got the most of everything because the old man worked for 2 and ate for 3. No one spoke. Everyone ate. Quietly. Warm. Safe. Snow fell outside the canopy. The fire crackled in the brazier. And 30 people who, 6 months ago, had been strangers, sat at one table and ate food grown and prepared by a man with the farmer class. Daniel sat down last. He ate in silence. He looked at them all. And he thought that in his past life, he had bred wheat varieties in a laboratory. He had written reports. He went to fairs. And not once had he seen the faces of the people his grain fed. Now he saw them. The 11th month. Winter settled heavily on Illyrion. It snowed for 3 days straight, burying the roads knee-deep. The temperature dropped so low that the water in the ditches froze overnight. Daniel checked the greenhouse every 4 hours. The glass held, but inside it was barely above freezing. He lined the walls of the greenhouse with straw. He placed clay pots filled with charcoal inside, an improvised heating system. The fire blossom survived. The moon daisies in the covered beds slowed their growth but did not die. The mycelium in the soil was working. The symbiotic fungus proved resistant to the cold. Its underground network continued to draw moisture and mana from deep layers where the ground did not freeze. The farm breathed even in winter. The village around it survived, 32 people. 2 new refugees arrived before the snowfall. A man with frostbitten feet and a boy of about 8, father and son. Their village to the north had died out within a month. The well had frozen over. There were no supplies. They had walked through the snow for 2 days. Daniel treated the frostbite with an ointment made from silverweed and moon chamomile. Ha-Un prepared a warming decoction. Mira wrapped the boy in blankets. Ariel stood at the gate and looked north. There, beyond the hills, villages were dying. Villages the capital didn't know and didn't want to know. The supplies in the granary were dwindling. Daniel counted them every evening. There would be enough wheat to last until the end of winter if they kept a strict ration. Vegetables until the middle of the 2nd month. Honey in abundance. He hadn't touched the dried chamomile or the fermented fire blossom. That was a strategic reserve. On the 12th day of winter, Say left, quietly, at dawn. She left a note on the table, brief. She had to return to the capital. Her father was waiting for a report. She would return, she promised. And at the bottom, a line that made Daniel pause. Thanks for the carrots. Ariel read the note over his shoulder. She said the princess had left to report, that in a month, royal officials might come here, or soldiers, or both. Daniel nodded. He knew, but he couldn't control everything. He could control the farm. The rest was beyond his land. Winter dragged on. Long, gray, cold. Daniel worked, every day. He sorted through seeds for spring planting. He planned to expand the fields. He sketched diagrams of new beds on scraps of cloth. Ha-Un experimented with fermentation. She had placed the fruit of power in a 30-day cycle within a mixture of honey and mountain moss. Mira kept records. The notebook became a second one, then a third. She classified all her observations into categories: crops, soil, weather, mycelium, a separate notebook for each magical culture. Daniel looked at her system and thought that at his university they would have awarded a grant for such work. Ariel trained every morning, even in the snow, even in the frost. The sword sliced through the cold air with a quiet whistle. She had grown stronger since she arrived. Her left hand had fully recovered. She trained the village men. Basic techniques: how to hold a spear, how to stand in formation, how not to run when scared. 5 men from among the refugees and Thorn. 6 people, not an army, but better than nothing. On the 20th day of winter, Daniel discovered something new at the far edge of the field. A sprout. In the frozen ground, under a layer of snow. It shouldn't have been growing. The temperature was below 0. The soil was frozen solid to the touch, but the sprout was sticking out of the ground, golden, glowing, warm to the touch. The snow around it was melting in a circle with a radius of a step. Daniel activated soil perception and held his breath. Heart of Dawn, magical crop, rank B, properties. A single use of the fruit permanently increases one of the owner's physical attributes by 10 points. The effect is irreversible. Restriction: 1 fruit per person per lifetime. Repeated use has no effect. Conditions for appearance: soil vitality must be above 40. The magical agriculture skill must be at least level 5. A 3rd-generation mycelial network. Maturation period: 12 months. Market value: cannot be determined. Daniel knelt in the snow, gazing at the golden sprout, and the world around him fell silent. Permanently increases stats. Irreversible. This isn't a temporary boost lasting a couple of hours. It's a permanent alteration of the body. 1 fruit per person, per lifetime. Heart of Dawn, 12 months to mature, a year, a whole year. This sprout appeared now. That means the fruit will be ready by next winter. If the farm survives, if they don't kill him, if they don't burn the field, if they don't steal the sprout. 12 months. He fenced the sprout with stones, covered it with straw, not for warmth, the sprout warmed itself, for camouflage, so the golden glow wouldn't be seen. He told only Ariel. She listened. She closed her eyes, opened them, and said one thing. Everyone will come for this. Daniel said he knew, and that they had a year. Ariel said a year wouldn't be enough. Daniel said it would be enough, because he had a plan. Winter ended at the close of the 12th month. The snow melted within a week. The ground thawed. The stream filled with meltwater. The pond overflowed. Daniel opened the floodgates and directed the water into the canals. The irrigation system was running at full capacity. Spring had come, but not the way everyone had expected. There was no rain, again. The meltwater disappeared quickly. The ground dried out by the middle of the first month of spring. The drought had returned. Worse than last year. The stream, which was supposed to be flowing full after winter, had run dry within 2 weeks. The wells in the neighboring villages began to dry up one after another. News came from Westmere. Grain prices had risen 5-fold. Bread riots in the poor neighborhoods. Guards were dispersing the crowds. Worse news came from the capital. King Tiberius IV had made an official announcement. There was a drought in the kingdom. Grain reserves were running low. The northern clans had refused to supply meat. Southern trading houses had tripled their prices. And on the northern border, Caesarea was stirring, a neighboring kingdom that had long awaited a moment of weakness. The world around Loughtonfield was burning, slowly, quietly, but inevitably. Daniel stood on the hill and looked toward the horizon. His fields were green, his pond was full, his greenhouse was working. His mycelium drew water from the depths. His farm was an oasis in the midst of a dying land, and that made it a target. By the end of the first month of spring, it wasn't refugees who came to the village. A detachment arrived. 40 men, with swords and bows, no banners, no colors, mercenaries, real ones, not the gray spear. These were on another level. Ariel saw them from the hill and ran down. Her face was pale, her hands on her sword. She said this wasn't a raid, it was a siege. 40 professionals, archers, swordsmen, 1 mage. She could tell by their gait, their gear, the way they moved. Someone had spent serious money. Daniel didn't panic. He had a plan. He'd been preparing it ever since he repelled the first raid. Months of preparation. The thorny ivy around the village had grown into a solid wall, 2 meters high, dense, with thorns a finger's length long. It could be cut through, but it would be long and noisy. The sleep-inducing vine had been dried and packed into 40 clay pots. Bitter root had been applied to every rope on every fence. Firefly grass covered all the paths leading to the village. The ditches around the gates had been deepened and widened. He summoned Ariel, Haun, Torna, the men of the militia. He gave out orders. Ariel at the gates, the main line. Haun is handing out fruit, fermented fire blossom to every fighter. Thorn and the militia on the walls with spears. Women and children in the barn's basement. Mira with them, with supplies and notebooks. Mira looked at him and said she wanted to stay upstairs. Daniel said no. The notebooks are more important. If the farm is destroyed, the notebooks are all that will remain, all that will allow us to start over. Mira pressed the notebooks to her chest. She nodded. She left. Daniel went out to the gate, alone, just like last time. The mercenary leader stood in front of a wall of prickly ivy and looked at it with professional interest. He glanced back at Daniel. He introduced himself. Commander Rain, the Free Company. He said he had orders. The farm, the harvest, the seeds, everything. Take it. The owner could leave, or he could stay and die. His choice. Daniel asked whose orders. Rain said it wasn't his business. The money had been paid, the contract signed. Nothing personal. Daniel nodded and asked for an hour to pack up. Rain looked at him, at the ivy-covered wall, at the gate, at the knight behind him with a sword. He thought, and said 1/2 an hour. Daniel went back through the gate. 1/2 an hour. Enough. He walked to the north wall, where the ivy was thickest, and activated a skill that Rain couldn't possibly know about. Farm Command, Level 3. Ability, Call of the Earth. All plants on the farm's grounds obey the owner's voice for 30 minutes. Growth accelerated 10-fold. He had acquired this skill 2 weeks ago, quietly, without fanfare. The system had simply updated when his level reached 7. He hadn't told anyone except Ariel. She asked what it meant. He said it meant his farm could bite. Daniel placed his hands on the ground, closed his eyes, and called out. The thorny ivy around the village quivered and began to grow. The ivy grew. Shoots as thick as an arm burst from the wall in all directions. The thorns lengthened, the branches intertwined. In 5 minutes, the 2-meter wall became 3. In 10, 4. New shoots crept along the ground in front of the wall, forming a strip of barbed wire 3 paces wide. Rain and his men retreated. The archers raised their bows. The mage in the back row began muttering something. His gloved hands glowed orange. A fire mage. Daniel saw it from the barn roof. Fire, the worst thing for a farm. One flaming arrow and the ivy would burst into flames. The field would burst into flames. The greenhouse would burst. A year's work in 10 minutes. He'd been waiting for this. He'd always been waiting for this. Because anyone who wants to destroy the farm will set it on fire first. And he had been preparing for this from day one. Yuna Cho. He didn't know her name yet. She had been standing behind the trees at the edge of the forest, watching what was happening for the 3rd day now. A water elementalist, a graduate of the Royal Academy. Pale, silver hair, thin-framed glasses. She had been sent here by royal decree 2 weeks ago to study the phenomenon. Celine had returned to the capital and reported. The royal chancellery had sent an observer, the most useless mage they could find. A water mage, lowest tier, a useless specialty. Exiled to the backwoods. Yuna stood in the forest and watched as 40 mercenaries prepared to burn down the village, and as a farmer on the roof of the barn looked at the fire mage, realizing there was nothing he could do about it. Ivy would stop the swords. Sleepy Vine would lull those nearby to sleep. But fire. Fire cannot be stopped by anything, except water. Yuna stepped out of the forest. She walked past the mercenaries. They turned around. A girl in an academy robe, silver hair, glasses. She looked like a librarian who had gotten lost on her way to a lecture. Rain shouted at her to get out of the way. Yuna stopped between the mercenaries and the wall of ivy. She turned toward the fire mage and raised her hands. Water from the pond, from the canals, from the ground, from the snow still lying in the shadows behind the trees. The water rose, not in a stream, a wall, a thin, transparent wall that stood between the village and the mercenaries. The fire mage released a ball. The flame struck the wall of water. It hissed. Steam. The wall held. The mage fired a second, a third. The wall trembled but held. Yuna stood with her hands raised, and drops of sweat, or water, or both, ran down her face. Ariel didn't wait. While the water wall held back the fire, she opened the gate and stepped out, with a sword. Fire bloom in her blood, eyes cold. Behind her, 6 of Torn's militiamen with spears. Yoon hurled 3 bots of sleep vine at the left flank. A cloud of pollen engulfed a dozen mercenaries. They began to fall. Ariel struck the right flank, not killing, crippling, precisely, quickly, knee, arm, shoulder. 5 men in a minute. Rain retreated. He led the remaining men back across the road. He counted them. Of the 40 in formation, 22 remained. 10 were asleep. 5 were wounded. 3 had lost their weapons in the ivy. The fire mage was spent and sat on the ground, breathing heavily. Yuna's wall of water stood. Rain looked at it all. At the wall of living ivy that kept growing. At the water barrier. At the knight who moved faster than a human should. At the militiamen whose eyes burned with something ordinary peasants don't possess. At the quiet village that refused to die. He turned to his men, told them the contract wasn't worth his company, and led them away. He gathered up the wounded, he gathered the sleeping ones, and set off north along the road. Yuna stood with her hands raised for another 3 minutes after the mercenaries had disappeared over the hill. Then she lowered her hands. The wall of water subsided, and Yuna sank down with it, to her knees, into the mud. Daniel climbed down from the roof. He approached her. She was pale, almost blue. Her hands were trembling. Her glasses had slipped to the tip of her nose. She looked up at him and said that she was Yuna Cho, a water elemental battle mage, an academy graduate, sent here by decree, for study. She wasn't supposed to interfere, but she couldn't just stand there and watch. Daniel crouched down beside her. He looked at her trembling hands, at her mud-stained cloak, at the glasses she was nervously adjusting. And he said he needed her help. Yuna blinked. She asked what kind. Daniel pointed to the ditches, to the pond, to the field, and said he had an irrigation system, a primitive one, clay channels, stones instead of taps, but if only he had a water mage who could direct the streams exactly where they were needed, who could draw water from deep underground, who could create mist to protect against frost, who could water every sprout individually. Then his farm would be invulnerable to drought. Not just his farm, any farm within that mage's range. Yuna listened. Her eyes behind her glasses grew wider and wider. She said quietly that at the academy they'd told her water magic was useless, weak for combat, weak for healing. Neither one thing nor the other. Her classmates, fire mages and lightning mages, were assigned to the guard and the orders. She was assigned to a farmer. Exile. Disgrace. Daniel looked at her seriously and said that those classmates could burn a field, but she could save an entire kingdom. Because the kingdom isn't dying from fire, it's dying of thirst. And the only person in this world who can give it water is kneeling in the mud right in front of him, thinking she's useless. Yuna looked at him. Her glasses had slipped down again. She didn't adjust them. Her lips trembled. She turned away, quickly. Daniel stood up and held out his hand to her. She took it. He helped her up. He said dinner would be in an hour, and that she needed to change. An academy robe isn't the best outfit for a farm. Yuna nodded, and for the first time during the entire conversation, she smiled. Subtly, hesitantly, like someone who had forgotten how. Ariel approached Daniel after Yuna left. She said the water wall was impressive, that a water mage of that caliber was a rarity, and that the academy, which considered this magic useless, was full of idiots. Daniel agreed. Yuna started working on the farm the next day. Daniel showed her the irrigation system. He explained how it worked. Yuna listened and nodded. Then she raised her hand over the ditch. The water inside stirred. It began to flow. Not by gravity. Directed. She divided the stream into 20 thin jets and directed each one to a separate plant. Precisely. Without waste, without splashing. Perfect drip irrigation controlled by magic. Daniel watched and thought that a single water mage was worth his entire irrigation system, and that he had just acquired the most valuable resource on the farm. A year, exactly 1 year since the initiation. Daniel stood on the hill above Lowenfield and looked down. The village had changed beyond recognition. 37 people, 14 houses, 6 of them were new, built by refugees from logs felled in the forest. Fields, 3 large ones, 2 small ones. A greenhouse doubled in size. A system of canals that Yuna filled with water every morning. A 3-meter-high wall of prickly ivy with a single passage at the gate. Compost pits, 3 of them. A mycelium network that permeated every patch of tilled soil. A granary full of grain. Cellars full of vegetables. A cache containing 54 fire blossom fruits and 12 of power. A single golden sprout of the heart of dawn, growing slowly in a sheltered corner of the field, covered with straw and invisible to anyone but Daniel and Ariel. Loughtonfield had become more than a village. It had become a model, proof, an example of what could be done with dead land if one knew how. Meanwhile, the drought was choking the kingdom. Officially declared in winter, by spring it had become a catastrophe. Rivers had shrunk by a third, lakes had receded from their shores, fields across Illyrian were scorched. This year's harvest would be half that of last year's, and last year's had been poor. Grain prices in the capital had risen 7-fold. Bread riots escalated into street battles. King Tiberius introduced food rationing. The army requisitioned grain from large landowners. Drummond lost a third of his warehouses. His trading network was crumbling. Daniel knew all this from Felis, who now came every 2 weeks. The merchant had become nervous, thin. His eyes darted about. He said that people in Westmere were hungry, that prices for his goods had fallen because people had no use for honey or hides. They needed bread. Daniel gave Felis a sack of wheat, for free. He said it was for his family. Felis took the sack and wept silently, sitting on the cart. A minute later he wiped his face, blowed his nose, and said that in the capital there were, about a farm in the south where there is never a drought, about a farmer who grows miracle fruits, about a village where no one goes hungry. The rumors reached the king. Daniel nodded. He had been expecting this. On the 3rd day of the 1st month of summer, a letter arrived. A messenger in the royal colors, an official seal, parchment with gold edging. The text was brief. Daniel Hayes, farmer of Loughtonfield, was ordered to appear in the capital of Valdemir for an audience with His Majesty King Tiberius IV. Deadline, 2 weeks. Attendance is mandatory. Ariel read the letter. She said it was either a reward or a trap. You never know with kings. Daniel said he would go. Ariel said she would go with him. Yoon said the farm was up to her and Yoon. Mira said the notebooks would be fine. Mira told him not to even think about bowing too low. He's a farmer, not a lackey. Daniel packed up in a day. He took samples with him. moon daisies, dried, fermented fire flower, 3 fruits of power, a small bag of seeds, and Mira's notebook, a copy, with a year's worth of data, numbers, graphs, evidence. The journey to the capital took 5 days, riding horses sent by the royal messenger. Along the road, Daniel had walked a year ago with a sack of poor grain. Back then, the fields along the road were gray and dreary. Now, they were dead. Dry, cracked earth, dead stalks, empty villages, boarded-up houses. People on the road, refugees, dozens, hundreds, heading south, toward the sea, or just walking, because it's impossible to stand on dead ground. Daniel watched them and clenched his fists. He could have helped one village. Thousands were dying here. The capital, Valdemir, greeted him with gray walls and angry faces. The city was full. Refugees from the provinces, merchants without goods, soldiers without pay. In the market, instead of the usual abundance, there were empty stalls. Bread cost a silver coin a loaf. Meat was a luxury. Daniel walked the streets and saw what he knew. The city was on the brink of famine. Another 3 months and a real famine would begin. Another 6 months, and people would start dying of starvation. The palace was beautiful, white stone, towers, flags, guards in ceremonial armor. Inside, it was cold and quiet. Daniel was led into the small throne room. Ariel was left at the door. She didn't argue, but her hand didn't let go of the sword. King Tiberius IV sat on the throne and looked 10 years older than his 50. Thin, gray, sunken eyes. Standing nearby stood Selene, in a princess's gown. With her back straight, she looked at Daniel and nodded almost imperceptibly. The king spoke. His voice was weary, unceremonious. He said he knew about the farm. He knew about the magical fruits. He knew about methods no other farmer in the kingdom possessed. He said the drought was killing his people, that the granaries were empty, that Caesarea had pulled her troops to the border and was waiting for the moment to strike, that he needed grain, fruits, methods, everything Daniel could provide. In return, the crown was ready to grant a title. Land, gold, protection, knights, anything he asks for. Daniel stood before the king and thought of Mira. Feed those before you, the rest will follow. He took out Mira's notebook, placed it on the table before the throne, said it contained a year's worth of observations, methods that triple the harvest, crop rotation, compost, mulching, irrigation, mycelium. Everything is described. Everything is documented. He said he was ready to share, with everyone, for free, without titles or gold. One condition. The king raised an eyebrow. Daniel said he wanted a decree, a royal decree that would oblige every farmer in the country to learn these methods, and a royal decree that would forbid any lord or guild from taking land away from a farmer who works it, and a third decree, the most important one that would declare the peasant class equal to any other class in rights and privileges. Silence. The king looked at him. The advisors behind the throne exchanged glances. Daniel returned from the capital a changed man. Not on the inside. Inside, he remained the same, but the world around him had changed. The royal decrees had been signed and sent out. Every farmer in the kingdom had the right to be taught new methods. No lord could take land away from a working farmer. 2 pieces of parchment that overturned a 1,000-year-old order. But Daniel had no time for celebrations. Caesarea declared war a week after his departure from the capital. 10,000 soldiers crossed the northern border, quickly, ruthlessly, without warning. They struck the kingdom, weakened by famine, like a predator strikes wounded prey. Illyrian responded slowly. The army was hungry and demoralized. Soldiers were deserting. Officers argued over strategy instead of fighting. The northern fortresses fell within 2 weeks. The Caesarian army was marching on the capital. And then Daniel did what he had been preparing for ever since he first grew the fire blossom. He opened the cache. 54 fire blossom fruits, 12 fruits of power, 24 fermented fire blossoms, enhanced to 35% potency, with a total value of several thousand gold pieces, a stockpile he had been building up for 9 months. He sent everything with Ariel to the capital, every last fruit, free of charge, for the army. Ariel carried 3 sealed chests and a personal letter for the king. In the letter, Daniel explained how to use the fruits. Fermented fire blossom for every soldier before battle, plus 35% stamina for 5 hours. The fruit of strength for commanders and the vanguard, plus 40% physical strength for 4 hours. Do not distribute to everyone at once. Distribute by company, by battle, by day. Stretch it out over the entire campaign. Ariel delivered the chests in 3 days. She returned 10 days later. She brought a reply from the king. One word, thank you, and a verbal report. The first battle involving the fruits took place at the crossing over the river Kelna, a 3,000-strong Caesarian vanguard against 1,000 Illyrian infantrymen, 1,000 soldiers, each of whom had eaten fermented fire blossom an hour before the battle. They fought for 5 hours, without stopping, without tiring. The Caesarians didn't know what was happening. Their enemy didn't run out of steam, didn't slow down, didn't retreat. 1,000 men held the crossing against 3,000 and didn't give up a single step. The Caesarian commander withdrew his troops, for the first time in the campaign. The second battle took place at the fortress of Hydemark. The vanguard commanders ate the fruits of power. 2 men struck the gates of the Caesarian siege line. 20 men, each of whom struck with 1.5 times the usual strength. They broke through the siege in 40 minutes. Ariel recounted this calmly, with facts, with numbers. But Daniel saw something in her eyes that could not be described by numbers. Pride, not for herself, for him. For his garden beds and his fruits and his quiet, stubborn work, which was now deciding the fate of the war. Daniel listened and felt nothing. No joy, no pride. He thought about how his fruits had been eaten before the battle, that people, under the influence of his berries, were killing other people, that the Caesarian soldiers were someone's sons too, that his farm had become part of the war. He didn't want that, but there was no choice. If Caesarea defeated Illyrion, famine would kill more people than the war. He accepted it, with difficulty, in silence, at night, alone in the outbuilding by lamplight. Meanwhile, Daniel wasn't sitting idle. While Ariel was transporting the fruit to the capital, he was carrying out the second part of the plan, the long-term one. He began to teach. The royal decrees gave him the right. He summoned farmers from neighboring villages, 5 of them, the most stubborn and the hungriest, those who weren't afraid to come to Lowenfield. He taught them crop rotation, composting, mulching, irrigation, the basics, the fundamentals, things that didn't require magical skills, just knowledge, just an understanding of how the earth works. 5 farmers in 3 weeks. Then they went back to their villages, with vetch seeds in their pockets, with a compost recipe in their heads, with sketches of the simplest irrigation ditches on scraps of cloth. Daniel didn't know if they would succeed, but he knew that even if just one of the 5 put what he'd learned into practice, even if just one village out of 5 survived this winter, it would be worth all the effort. Meanwhile, something else had happened. Lord Drummond had arrived, without warning, alone, on a tired horse. He had lost weight, he had aged. His gray beard had turned white, his eyes were the same, intelligent, heavy. He sat down at the table in the courtyard. Daniel poured tea. Drummond was silent for a minute. Then he said that his warehouses were empty, that there was no grain, that his 40,000 people were starving, that he had lost, not to Daniel, to the drought, to the land, time. He had lost because his system only worked when there was grain, and when there wasn't, the system was dead. He said that Daniel had been right a year ago, that the drought would show whose model worked. The drought had shown. Daniel listened and did not gloat. Sitting before him was a broken man who had spent 20 years building what had crumbled in a single season. Daniel took out a sack of wheat. He placed it on the table. He said it was for his people, not much, but enough for the time being, and that he had a proposal. Drummond looked up. Daniel said he needed logistics, transportation, warehouses, a distribution network, everything that Drummond knew how to do, and he didn't. In return, Daniel would provide methods, seeds, knowledge. Drummond wouldn't buy up grain and sell it at a markup. He would teach farmers and deliver their harvest where it was needed. A new system, not a monopoly, a network. Drummond was silent for a long time. Then he picked up a sack of wheat. He stood up and said one word. Agreed. He left. Daniel watched him go and thought that war and famine do strange things to people. They break some. They reshape others. Drummond was an enemy. He became an ally. Not because he had become better, because the world had become worse. Weeks passed. The war in the north continued. Daniel's fruits kept arriving at the army. A new harvest of fire blossom. New fruits of power. Ha-Un fermented non-stop. Yuna watered the fields day and night. Mira took notes. And Riel hauled chests. Cassandra Vale showed up out of the blue, the way people do who are used to walking in without knocking. Tall, dark hair, cold eyes, an expensive dress dusty from the road. Head of the Vale Trading House, a former competitor of Drummond's. She had come with a business proposal. She wanted to act as an intermediary between the farm and the cities. A percentage of sales, logistics, caravan security. Daniel listened. The proposal was well crafted, tough, beneficial to both sides. He asked why she needed this. She could trade in anything, after all. Cassandra paused. Then she said not just anything, that half of her trading partners had gone bankrupt, that the market had collapsed, that the only commodity rising in price was food, and that the only person who knew how to produce it under these conditions was sitting in front of her in a dirty shirt, drinking tea from a clay mug. Daniel said the terms would be his. Not maximum profit, fair distribution. Food goes where it's needed most, not where it's most expensive. Cassandra said that was bad business. Daniel said it wasn't business, it was survival. Cassandra looked at him, at his calm face, at his hands in the soil, at his small farm that fed 37 people and an entire army at the same time. And she said okay, on his terms. She put so much effort into that word it was as if she were tearing it out of herself with pliers. Daniel held out his hand. She shook it, firmly. 2 years passed. The war ended in the fall of the first year after the initiation. Not with a great battle, not with a heroic assault. It ended with starvation. The Caesarian army ate standard rations, hardtack, salted meat, porridge. After 6 months on the march, their supplies ran out. And the supply train from Caesarea was traveling along ravaged roads past empty villages and could not replenish their stocks. The Illyrian army ate Daniel's fruits, fire blossoms, fruits of the force, grain from his farm and the farms of his students. They were well fed, they were strong, and they stood their ground. The Caesarian commander requested negotiations in late fall. The peace treaty was signed a month later. Daniel wasn't at the signing. He was in the fields, planting winter crops. Because the war was over, but winter was not. And people want to eat every day, regardless of whether peace treaties have been signed. The year after the war was a year of recovery. Daniel trained 40 farmers, 40 people scattered across 40 villages with seeds and knowledge. Not everyone succeeded. 12 gave up, 7 didn't understand, but 21 farmers applied what they had learned. 21 villages reaped a harvest 3 times the norm. 21 villages survived the winter. Drummond built out the logistics. His carters and warehouse workers were back in action. Only now, they weren't hauling grain bought up on the cheap, but seeds and compost and instructions written in Mira's own hand. Cassandra Ville organized a distribution network. 5 cities, 12 warehouses, regular deliveries. Not with the highest markup, with a fair one. She grumbled that it was the worst deal of her life, but her eyes told a different story. Yuna had become more than just a water mage. She had become a legend. The Royal Academy sent 3 students to her for an internship. 6 months later, they returned and wrote a paper that revolutionized the teaching of water magic. Irrigation, groundwater management, fog screens to protect against frost, precision irrigation. Everything Yuna had learned to do on the farm. The academy that had exiled her was now inviting her back. As a professor, Yuna refused. She said she was happy here. Ha-Un opened a laboratory, a small one, in the annex behind the barn. 3 tables, 100 pots, 200 bags of herbs. She fermented everything she could. She experimented every day. She found a way to enhance moon chamomile through fermentation, to the point where its healing properties were comparable to potions costing 50 gold. The production cost was 3 silver. Mira no longer coughed. Not at all. She walked upright. She ruled the village with a firm and just hand. The refugees and the old-timers obeyed her, and new farmers, and even Cassandra Vale, who came once a month and tried to renegotiate the terms every time, only to leave empty-handed every time. Mira filled 12 notebooks. Complete documentation of all crops, all methods, all experiments, every parameter, every date, every observation. Daniel told her once that those notebooks were worth more than all the gold in the royal treasury. Mira blushed to her ears and ran away, but she clutched the notebooks to her chest even tighter. Ariel stood beside Daniel every day. She trained the militia, which had grown to 20 men. She patrolled the perimeter. She repaired the fence. She sharpened her sword. And every evening, she sat with him by the fire, in silence, side by side, shoulder to shoulder. They didn't talk about what was between them. There was no need. One evening, after a long day, when everyone had gone their separate ways and the fire was burning down to embers, she turned to him, looked at him, and kissed him. Briefly, firmly, like a soldier. Then she stood up and left. Daniel sat by the fire and stared at the embers, and smiled. Celine came 4 times a year, each time in a simple dress, each time she worked in the garden, each time she left with tears she hid behind her straight back. She was waging her own war in the capital, a quiet one, a diplomatic one, pushing through the third decree on the equality of the farmer class. The advisors resisted, the lords resisted, the orders resisted, the entire system resisted. Because recognizing a farmer as equal to a swordsman meant admitting that 1,000 years of hierarchy had been a lie. Celine did not give up. She would come to the council. She would place Mira's notebook on the table. She would open the page showing the yield, and she would ask in a quiet voice that everyone could hear, "Who among those present could grow grain to feed the army?" The advisors were silent. Zari's heart ripened at the beginning of winter in the second year. Exactly 12 months after the golden sprout had broken through the frozen ground, Daniel came to it at dawn, alone. The fruit hung on the stem, the size of an apple, golden, glowing, warm. The snow around it was melting. The air smelled of honey and earth after the rain, and something else for which Daniel had no word. The system indicated heart of dawn, ripe, quality, legendary, effect. Permanently increases one physical attribute by 15 points, base 10. +5 from mycelial symbiosis and soil quality. 15 points. Forever. Irreversible. It was the most valuable item in Illyrian. More valuable than any sword. More valuable than any artifact. More valuable than any crown. Daniel plucked the fruit, held it in his palms. Warm. Alive. A year's work. A year of earth and water and sun and mycelium and care. A year and a single fruit. He could sell it for any price. Could give it to the king and get anything he wanted. He could have eaten it himself and grown stronger. He went to Mira's house. The old village elder was sitting at the table, drinking her morning broth. Daniel entered. He placed the fruit before her. Mira looked at the golden apple. She looked at him. Her eyes grew wet. She didn't ask what it was. She knew. Everyone in the village knew that something impossible was growing at the far edge of the field. Mira said she didn't need it, that she was an old woman, that the fruit was needed more by the young. Daniel said that she had coughed up blood on the first day he arrived, that she had outlived 4 farmers and buried 3 hopes, that for 40 years she had kept this village going through sheer stubbornness, and that she would live to see spring, and the next one, and the next, because he had decided so. Mira took the fruit. Her hands were shaking. She took a bite, chewed, swallowed, closed her eyes, and Daniel saw her face change. The wrinkles hadn't disappeared, but something beneath them shifted. The back that had been hunched for 40 years slowly straightened. Her hands stopped trembling. When she opened her eyes, they were clear. Clear like those of a person who had been given back 20 years of life. Mira stood up, easily, without a creak in her knees, without her usual groan. She stood up and stood straight. She looked at her hands, clenched her fists, unclenched them, and looked at Daniel. She said nothing. She just hugged him. The small, stiff old woman hugged him and held him for a long time. Then she let go, wiped her eyes, and walked toward the gate. Daniel followed her out. The village was waking up. People were coming out of their houses. Ariel by the well, Haun with a teapot, Yuna in the field, Mira with a notebook, Thorn with buckets, children, refugees who had become neighbors, women, old people, 37 people, his farm, his land. The winter sun hung low. The fields lay under the snow. Beneath the snow, the mycelium worked. The roots lived. The earth breathed. In 3 months, spring. In 6 months, a new harvest. In a year, a new heart of dawn. And new farmers in other villages. And new decrees. And a new world. Slowly, grain by grain. Just as a farmer should. 2 months later, Daniel received a letter from the capital. Celine wrote that the 3rd decree had been signed. The farmer class was officially equal to any other class in Illyrian, in rights, in privileges, in honor. She wrote that an old priest from the great temple, the very same one, the one who had assigned Daniel his class at his initiation, the priest stood to the side and said nothing. But when the king affixed his seal, the priest smiled. For the first time in 20 years, someone had seen him smile. Daniel read the letter, folded it, put it in his pocket, stepped out onto the porch. Spring was beginning. The snow was melting. The ground was thawing. The stream was filling up. It was time to plant. Ariel followed him out. She stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder. She asked what was in the letter. Daniel said that the third decree had been signed. Ariel nodded. She was silent for a moment. Then she asked, "And what now?" Daniel looked at her, at the field, at the trees, at the people coming out of their houses and heading to the garden beds, at Ha-un carrying a sack of seeds, at Yoon drawing water from the pond into the canals, at Mira running toward the field with a notebook pressed to her chest, at Mira standing at the gate, straight and strong, watching the road where people were walking. New people, farmers from distant villages who had come to learn. Daniel turned to Ariel and said that now it was the same as yesterday, and the day before yesterday, and tomorrow. Plant, water, wait, harvest, feed, teach, plant again. He stepped down from the porch. He picked up a shovel and walked toward the field. 6 months later, the first initiation after the war took place. In the great temple. Stained glass windows, the altar, a line of teenagers, a priest in a golden robe. That very one, the old one, with eyes that knew more than they spoke. A boy climbed the steps. The priest placed his hand on his forehead. The altar flashed green. The priest's voice echoed under the arches. Class. Farmer. Silence. A second. 2. And the hall applauded. The boy stood on the platform with his eyes wide open. His mother stood in the front row, proudly, with her back straight. His father stood beside her. They clapped. The whole hall was clapping, because everyone in that hall had eaten bread that winter, and everyone knew where it came from. In the back row stood a man in simple clothes. His hands were calloused, dirt under his fingernails, his face weathered by the sun. Standing next to him was a woman with a scar across her eyebrow and a sword at her belt, and a herbalist with a long black braid, and a girl with a notebook, and a silver-haired woman in glasses, and a red-haired princess in a simple dress, and a tall brunette in an expensive coat, who, for the first time in many years, wasn't counting money but simply stood beside the people she trusted. Daniel looked at the boy, at his face, at the applause, at the mother who was crying with pride, not shame. And he thought that 2 years ago he had stood in that very same spot, and the audience had laughed. But now the audience was clapping. Not for him. The boy, the new farmer, the first farmer in the history of Illyrian to be greeted with applause. Ariel stood beside him. She placed her hand on his shoulder, squeezed it, briefly, in a soldierly way. Daniel didn't look back. He looked at the boy and smiled. Then he walked out of the hall, into the square, under the open sky. The sun was high. Clouds were rolling in from the west, full, heavy, rainy. The first real rain clouds in 2 years. Daniel looked up at the sky, then at his hands, at the ground beneath his feet, and he thought that home was nice. But it was time to plant.